Chapter 211. The carriages passed the border and entered the entrance of the border region. The expedition team got off the carriages and began to march toward the destination. Not a single monster attacked them during their march. In fact, they didn't see even a single one of them. This was because the nearby area was frequented by humans and the members of the Federation. Unlike the Forest of Denial, which bordered the parasite's territory, hundreds or even thousands of monster subjugations had already taken place here. As a result, the expedition team was able to walk without disturbance until the sun set. Jesus, it's almost night. Can those bastards be any slower? What if they're trying to screw us over by scaring us and preventing us from falling asleep? Cho Hong spat out one complaint after the other, even suggesting that the Federation was going to ambush them after sucking them dry of their stamina. Sol Ji-hoo didn't say anything because he knew she was simply grumbling from the boring march. Why aren't they here yet? In truth, Sol Ji-hoo was rather worried. The words, "never sleep," kept weighing on his mind. They were still far from their destination. At this rate, they would have no choice but to march through the night. At that moment, Kazuki, who was leading the group, suddenly stopped. "Mr. Kazuki?" Silence. Sol Ji-hoo quickly walked up. Kazuki was glaring with his mouth shut and his eyes straight ahead. It was as if he was saying, "Would you look at this?" And soon, Kazuki spoke quietly. "Sorry." Everyone expressed concerns at his sudden apology. "I was trying to be mindful." A single bead of cold sweat fell from Kazuki's cheek. "But it seems we're surrounded." Sol Ji-hoo took a good look around him. Left, right, forward, and backward. He could only see dense trees and thick grass. A bleak wind blew. "Ho!" A short exclamation of awe carried by the wind flowed into their ears. Sol Ji-hoo's eyes widened slightly. He couldn't see anyone, yet he could hear such a clear voice. "You have excellent senses, human." Cho Hong immediately raised her thorn of steel and got into her battle stance. Teresa pulled Cho Hong back, then shouted, "Weren't you contacted by the upper echelon?" "We are. We know." The voice gave a calm affirmation. Sol Ji-hoo focused on the voice. "But there's a slight problem that prevents us from revealing ourselves to you." The slightly husky voice wasn't clear, but it wasn't unpleasant because it was deep. In fact, it gave off the scent of a powerful warrior. "Can you stand still without asking any questions or making any demands?" "Of course, we mean you should do as we say." "What bullshit is this?" "No way." Cho Hong threw Teresa off angrily and raised her mace threateningly. Marcel Guionia also tightened his grip on his crossbow. The two of them each had their own view of the Federation, but they couldn't just stand still, being told this after getting surrounded. "If you don't agree, we will have to ask you to leave." "We will neither attack nor chase after you." When the voice spoke as if it wasn't a big deal, Maria clenched her fists. "Who are you to tell us what to do? We're going somewhere." "Then you may continue. But you will regret it." The voice spoke mockingly and nonchalantly. "Do as you want. But to give you advice for rescuing our comrades, we suggest you go back to Eva immediately. Go to Invidia's temple without running into humans, if possible." This really came out of the blue. But rather than repeating the things the voice said like a parrot, Sol Ji-hoo remembered the condition the Federation had said earlier. "We aren't allowed to sleep on our way back either?" "Smart. Foo 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 foo." Subdued laughter rang out. Sol Ji-hoo pondered. It would have been better if the voice gave a clear explanation, but as the situation stood now, he was at a crossroad. If this were a game, the screen would show something like this. Listen to the Federation and stand still obediently. Leave the Foxman children and continue the expedition. Leave the Foxman children and return to Eva. I don't feel any malice or hostility. In fact, it feels like he's trying to help us. Left with these choices, Sol Ji-hoo activated his 9 eyes. As soon as he checked the color, he exclaimed in shock. Ah! Red.
Immediate retreat recommended. The important thing was that the red color only existed around Seoul Jihu and the members of the expedition. The place where the Federation was presumed to be was yellow, and the rest of the region was green.
He had committed a grave blunder.
Since when was the expedition team dyed in red? Could it be?
Seoul Jihu looked down at Haya, who was in his arms, then immediately made up his mind. Chohong, lower your weapon.
What?
Oi, Seoul. Chung Chohong. When Chohong tried to object, Kazuki failed to hold himself back and growled. Loosen your shoulders a bit. Chohong furrowed her brows, hearing his cold biting remark.
What? What did you just say?
You were capable of separating your public and private life when you were level 4, so what's this?
Now that you're a high ranker, are you suddenly too proud to listen to your leader?
Chohong shrunk back, sensing the icy needles that were shooting out of Kazuki's glaring eyes.
That was how enraged Kazuki was. Not only is this the leader's decision, but I, the header, am also staying silent. What qualification do you have to keep acting as you please in this expedition?
Chohong did not know this, but Kazuki had been displeased ever since the group ran into Harem. Even Seoul Jihu, the leader of the expedition, asked for and respected his opinions, but Chohong had been ignoring his authority as the header.
Chohong quickly turned purple with rage. But in the end, her mouth, which seemed ready to burst out with all sorts of curses, closed shut. During an expedition, all decisions were made through the leader and the header's combined consent.
Chohong really didn't have anything to say once Kazuki brought up this basic rule. While she fumed, she obediently put her mace down. She then took in a deep breath and spat out. Okay. I'll be more careful in the future. Though she was temperamental, cleanly admitting her faults was one of Chohong's good points. May we presume that your staying means you will do as we say?
Seoul Jihu replied back.
We will accept your help. Good. Then we will send someone over. Stay still and do not move. Just like the voice said, someone appeared from the grass.
Seoul Jihu couldn't make out the figure's face as a spotless white cloth was covering every inch of the figure. It almost seemed as if the figure was a shrine maiden wearing a ceremonial robe. The only other notable feature was that the figure held a smoked tree branch that seemed to have been struck by lightning.
The figure walked forward, stopping a little way in front of the group. Silence filled the air.
Just as Seoul Jihu realized that he was staring at the figure too fixedly, the tree branch suddenly pointed at him.
Human. Seoul Jihu placed his hand on his chest as if to ask, me? The figure in front of him slowly nodded. Try activating the power of your left bracelet, please. Unlike before, the voice was clear and silvery.
Now that he got a closer look, the hand holding onto the tree branch was a white apricot color. A sky fairy? That was the first thought that popped up in his head, but Seoul Jihu quickly set the thought aside and roused his mana.
Wang.
A tri-circular shield formed from his left wrist.
Seoul Jihu showed the shield off, spinning it side to side, but the figure did not budge.
It was then. PSSSSH. Seoul Jihu doubted his eyes.
2 of the 3 circular shields turned to dust and began to scatter away. The blessing of the circum protected its user from 3 types of attacks: physical, magical, and witchcraft. Of these 3, the 2 shields protecting him from magic and witchcraft were quickly withering away. As we thought, you've been infected. The figure took a few steps forward before carefully reaching her hand out. Talk, talk. Starting from Seoul Jihu, she hit everyone's foreheads with the tree branch. Seoul Jihu's bewilderment only lasted a moment.
Soon, his eyes widened for a whole other reason.
And that was because he felt a refreshing energy spreading from his head down to his body.
He didn't feel that there was anything wrong with his body before, but he now felt refreshed as if he just got out of the sauna.
The purification operation has been completed. The figure went around the expedition team before turning around and speaking in a terse manner.
Sol Ji-hoo noticed that parts of the white cloth covering the figure turned black, almost as if it was scorched by fire.
Good. Next. In the next moment, shadows shot up around them. About 10 shadows formed a circle around the expedition team before slowly getting closer.
There was one shadow that took the lead and walked forward with big strides. This figure was a tall woman with thin, sharp ears. Sol Ji-hoo's attention was taken away by the woman, whose black hair reached all the way down to her butt.
She was wearing a maroon-colored leather jacket and ivory-colored leather pants. 4 daggers were hanging on one side of her hip, and a long sword wrapped in a leather cloth was hanging on the other side. The thing that stood out the most was that her otherwise white face had a black band covering her eyes. Sol Ji-hoo didn't know whether it was purely for outward appearance or if there was a reason behind it, but what he couldn't deny was that she gave off a mysterious aura because of it. Soon, her knee-high boots with black cleats stopped. Sol Ji-hoo raised his eyes and turned to the woman standing still with a tree branch. Once he saw her again, he became certain. The person who appeared first was from a different race than the other 10. First, their skin color was different. Although they all had white skin tone, the woman holding the tree branch had a healthy tone on her skin. On the other hand, the ones covering their eyes were pale as if they grew up inside a cave, never having been exposed to sunlight. They were so white that Sol Ji-hoo felt like he was seeing white limestone. Most importantly, their smell was different. If the woman wearing the ceremonial dress gave off a fruity scent, then the other 10 gave off the smell of chlorine similar to that of a swimming pool. I see, so you're the war hero known as the adversary. Sol Ji-hoo groaned. The woman who seemed to be the group's leader was standing right in front of him. From the back, Sol Ji-hoo could hear Teresa letting out a startled, "Oh, my." "Let me introduce myself." The woman reached out. "My name is Uiral Antrim Ballenheim." Sol Ji-hoo grabbed her hand. "I'm Sol Ji-hoo." "Sol Ji-hoo. Your surname is Sol and your name is Ji-hoo?" Uiral gripped his hand lightly before letting go and walking over to Teresa, who was staring with widened eyes. "This is the first time we're meeting each other. You're prettier in person." "Yes, we've only seen each other through communication crystals until now." "Thank you for your compliment." Teresa also shook hands and laughed delightedly. "Thank you for the previous war. We recaptured Tiggle Fortress with ease thanks to you." "Not at all. With this, we've repaid the debt for stopping the mutant orc mass production plan." "Ah. Also, I heard. Though it's a little late, I'm sorry for your loss of breast choo-choo." Teresa breathed out a light sigh. "Thank you." Sol Ji-hoo furrowed his brows. Breast choo-choo? No matter how he thought about it, translating it literally, it meant, kissing tits. Just as he thought, I don't know who it is, but that's a stupid name. Like Titties. He said that his surname was Titties and that his given name was like For some reason, Ian flashed by his brain. No way. What a shame. There aren't many people who understood the Federation like Haremark's royal magician. Hearing Uiral's regretful comment, Sol Ji-hoo closed his eyes. It seemed Ian really left his mark wherever he went. Clicking his tongue inwardly, Sol Ji-hoo stared at Uiral, who was having a small conversation with Teresa. The aura she was giving off was no joke, and Sol Ji-hoo had personally felt this when he grabbed her hand. He couldn't help but wonder if she was far stronger than she seemed. Anyways, this is a surprise. I didn't think you'd come personally. I was around the border region for a business when I was contacted by the upper echelon. I set everything aside and came here since I was interested. Sol Ji-hoo became convinced after what Teresa said. Noticing that Sol Ji-hoo was curious, Kazuki whispered, "She's a cave fairy." "I'm glad." As he thought, she wasn't a sky fairy. "You're glad?" "Cave fairies are similar to humans, and they view us favorably as well." Kazuki continued.
This Uiral woman must be the fairy general. The fairy general? The second in command of the cave fairies.
Think of her as the commander-in-chief. I'm positive.
Valentine is.
Kazuki closed his mouth, not finishing his sentence.
This was because Uiral turned around and faced Sol Jihu.
Seeing Heya in his embrace, she grinned. You little rascals. Aying.
Heya groaned and dug deeper into Sol Jihu's embrace.
Uiral giggled. Thank you again. These two children's mother is on her way. We said we would bring them back, but she insisted on coming. I'm glad to bring them back safe and sound. Here. Sol Jihu was about to hand Heya over, but paused.
Heya was refusing to let go. What's wrong?
It's time to go back.
Sol Jihu forced her off and put her down, but Heya waddled back and clung to his leg. Heya?
Rar.
You don't want to go?
Rar.
The heck? He tried to console Heya, but she refused to budge. Rather than liking him a lot, it seemed like she was afraid of the cave fairy.
Most likely, Foxman must hate or be unfriendly with the cave fairies.
Sol Jihu didn't know what to do. Seeing this, Uiral opened her mouth. Don't worry.
Worst case, we can grab her by the tail or knock her unconscious. Rar, rar.
Sol Jihu was beginning to see why Heya was afraid.
Uiral stroked the cloth covering her eyes before speaking.
Setting these two aside, I heard you were going somewhere. May I know why you came all the way here? It's to go to a place called the Pagoda of Infection. Sol Jihu didn't try to hide where they were going. He knew there was no point with a sky fairy in their midst.
Uiral asked.
The Pagoda of Infection? You mean, the Pagoda of Dreams?
Is that what it's called in the Federation?
Well, I guess they're both correct names, in a sense.
Uiral nodded her head, murmuring to herself.
Sol Jihu gulped.
He was thinking that this might be the case, and now he was certain.
However, this also meant that the Federation learned of the pagoda first.
But he wasn't worried. According to Harem, the Pagoda of Dreams was the Federation's forbidden ground.
There was a good chance that the inheritance was still buried, not having been discovered. Is it absolutely necessary to go? If possible, I suggest you return. Is there a problem with going?
Problem? Are you asking if the Federation is uncomfortable with you going? Well, I don't really mind. Uiral rubbed the back of her head before sighing.
But I think it would be a shame if the hero those sparrows revived using their precious elixir died in vain.
With that, Uiral tilted her head up. She seemed to be savoring the evening glow, even though it shouldn't be visible. Are you going right away?
Sol Jihu shook his head.
It was better to go in the morning than at night. Then you'll probably camp out for the night. A light flickered on in Sol Jihu's eyes. As he wasn't stupid, he easily understood that she was trying to tell him something.
This was the perfect opportunity as he was worried about the lack of information about the place. Not to mention, the number of questions he had only kept growing as the expedition progressed.
If it's all right, can you tell us about the Pagoda of Infection in detail? Of course, that's easy. And to be honest, Uiral nodded her head as though she had been waiting for these words.
Then, she turned her gaze down.
Underneath her veiled eyes. I wanted to talk to you at least once. Red lips that contrasted her peachy skin curled into a seductive smile. Chapter 212.
After accepting Uiral's offer, Sol Jihu ordered the expedition team to set up camp around the area. Now that he had permission from the Federation, he no longer had any qualms about loitering around the border region. He was rather lucky that the cave fairies had come to greet him as well. As the last race admitted by the Federation, the cave fairies prioritized feelings over reason. How Uiral was acting was the perfect example of this.
It was clear that she came out of personal curiosity and amusement rather than to keep an eye on them. Sol Jihu decided to use this to his advantage. Uiral wasn't a normal fairy, but the fairy general who supposedly supervised her entire race. Forming a good relationship with her seemed to be in his interest.
How should I treat her? After much consideration, Sol Ji-hoo decided to go with dinner that would show off his skills, but also not make the other side feel uncomfortable. He happened to have the perfect ingredients, as he had brought all sorts of food ingredients during his last trip to Earth.
Just making ramen isn't enough. He grinned as he took out plain noodles from his bag.
After slicing up beef seasoned with salt, frying eggs and then chopping them up, and dicing up mushrooms and zucchini, Sol Ji-hoo took out the boiled noodles, moved them to empty bowls, then garnished them with the vegetables. Then, he poured in the broth cooked with soy sauce, kelp, green onions, and refined rice wine.
Once he added ground sesame seeds mixed with salt and prepared kimchi, extravagant banquet noodles were ready. 1.
He put quite a bit of effort into making this meal, and it rightly looked delicious even in his eyes. The meal was a total success, as an uproar broke out in the camp.
Amazing! This is amazing! Ah! I'd kill for another bowl. Hugo slurped up the noodles in a hurry. He was basically a living vacuum cleaner. Kya!
The broth has such a deep taste.
Cho-hong hollered with a big grin.
Sol Ji-hoo smiled. It's good, right?
Yeah. It has a really refreshing taste. Kya ha! Cho-hong chuckled like a fool and gulped the broth down from the bowl. I don't get it.
Thai Sora was also busily moving her chopsticks, tilting her head with every taste.
Arg, did he really not put any drugs in this? I normally hate noodles. Fuck. Maria was the same. Sol Ji-hoo rubbed his chin in satisfaction as he watched his comrades enjoy the meal more than he originally imagined. Then, he seriously considered opening up a noodle shop in paradise once everything ended. It looks good. Flown? Sol Ji-hoo looked down in an instant.
A small puff of smoke was peeking out of the pendant.
She had been sleeping the entire afternoon, but it seemed the smell of food woke her up.
Do you want to try it?
I wasn't going to try it at first, but everyone's eating it so deliciously.
Judging by her pleading tone, it seemed she really wanted to try it now.
Sure, you can have a bowl too. He.
After serving a bowl to Flown, Sol Ji-hoo turned to where the members of the Federation were sitting. His noodles might taste good to humans, but he wasn't sure if members of another race would like it as well. However, he soon realized that his worry was for nothing. Hario and Heya practically had their heads in their bowls, and their spinning tails showed how much they liked it. As for Yuirol,
slurparpiarpi. She was making a truly incredible sound, shoving the noodles into her mouth hole. Her mouth seemed too small to fit all of it in, but she managed and even swallowed successfully.
Seeing her wrap the last little bit with kimchi, Sol Ji-hoo started. She really knows how to eat.
Delicious.
After finishing a bowl in the blink of an eye, Yuirol turned to Sol Ji-hoo and pushed her bowl forward.
I'll take another bowl. It felt like she was saying, hurry up with my refill. Rather than, give me more. Good thing I made plenty of broth.
Sol Ji-hoo nodded his head as he put more noodles into the pot.
In any case, Yuirol really ate well. If she stars in a mukbang, too, she'll make a fortune through donations. Using a communication crystal to show a recording of Yuirol eating to all regions of paradise. Now wouldn't that be an amazing advertisement? While Sol Ji-hoo was busy thinking about his business idea, Yuirol ate sumptuously. Gulp, gulp. Pooh! Yuirol exclaimed in delight after gulping down the broth. Only after finishing 4 bowls did she pat her bulging belly. She sat around feeling full and satisfied, then nodded her head with the words, as I thought. She continued. Humans are such fine creatures.
Sol Ji-hoo smiled wryly.
It was an excessive compliment for simple banquet noodles.
We can't go without this on such a fine day.
Yuirol rummaged around her waist, then took out a leather canister.
Oh!
Me too. Me too.
Hugo shot up when he saw liquor, then glanced to check Sol Jihoo's reaction. Since this was a place to better their relationship, Sol Jihoo figured it would be fine to be a little loose and nodded his head. "Don't drink too much though. Won't you have a glass as well?"
Yu-il asked after pouring the liquor for Hugo. Sol Jihoo didn't say no. "This is my favorite liquor, clear honey spider wine." "Clear honey spider wine?"
"It's made from fermenting the spider's threads."
"It should be good,"
Yu-il replied as she poured a viscous, white liquid in a glass.
"Here. Try it." "Thank you." The wine really had a unique flavor. Because it was so viscous, he wanted to keep it in his mouth. When he pulled it down his throat, the savory smell of milk spread out. Sol Jihoo, what is the meaning of that act? Why did you place your hands under the glass and tilt your head back to drink? Is that the Earthling's drinking etiquette? Ah, yes.
Sol Jihoo replied. "It doesn't mean anything special, but I learned from a young age that I should do this when I'm drinking with a senior."
Ho! And who did you learn that from?
My father.
Aha! I see. Excellent, truly excellent. Senior, you say? Ha ha!
Yu-il burst into laughter again.
She looked extremely happy for some reason.
Sol Jihoo tilted his head, but it seemed calling her his senior worked wonders. The cave fairies were a race that prioritized hierarchy as much as the army. They naturally cared a lot about the virtue of command and discipline and were strict enough to execute anyone who committed mutiny or insubordination.
So how could Yu-il not be happy being treated to dinner and even being addressed as a senior in front of her subordinates?
Not to mention it was from humanity's hero, who killed the first army commander. A silent moonlit night, superb food, and a new friend. What a wonderful day this has been. Yu-il took a shot and tilted her head in a burst of laughter.
She's pretty cool. Sol Jihoo had a feeling she would get along with Hao Win. With a burp, Yu-il put the glass down.
"Oh right, you said you had something you wanted to ask, no?"
Now they were getting down to business. "Go ahead.
I'll answer most questions."
It really looked like she would answer almost anything.
As Sol Jihoo had more than a couple questions he wanted to ask, he took a moment to organize his thoughts.
First,
why did you say we shouldn't sleep until we met up with you? Because you will dream if you sleep.
Yu-il answered with clarity before pointing to the side. Those two,
Harem and Hea, were hugging each other in sleep.
Those cheeky brats broke the taboo and entered the forbidden ground.
The moment they stepped foot into the forbidden ground, they had been cursed with magic and witchcraft. The important thing is that this curse is contagious.
It can spread to anyone who is nearby. Sol Jihoo's jaw dropped. Ah,
so that's why you told us to stand still. Then that ritual must have been to lift the curse.
Exactly. I heard Harem and Hea followed the sky fairies to see their ritual. Does this mean they went to lift the curse in the pagoda?
In truth, this was the most important question. If the Federation was in the middle of conquering the pagoda, it would be hard for the expedition to claim authority over it.
No.
If it was possible to lift the curse, the Federation would have conquered the pagoda a long time ago.
We gave up because it was deemed impossible.
There's a reason it is a designated forbidden ground.
Sol Jihoo was relieved, but a corner of his mind filled up with worry.
He could imagine how difficult the expedition would be if even the powerful Federation had no choice but to give up.
This is the reason the sky fairies held a ritual.
Wait a moment. At that moment, a woman who was sitting by herself slurping noodles, cut in.
It was the woman wearing a ceremonial robe, a sky fairy.
That ritual is the sky fairy's internal affair. There's no reason for us to go out of our way to reveal everything.
Tisk, so stingy.
Yu-il clicked her tongue.
All I'm saying is that you don't need to go so deep into the detail. He's treated us to a fantastic dinner, and you personally ate 2 bowls of it.
You're saying you can't even do this? If this matter involved the Sky Fairy's internal affair, Seol Ji-hoo didn't need to push to hear the answer.
And so, just as he was about to move on to the next question, "Kook!" the Sky Fairy groaned. She was clearly upset and a little ashamed.
Seol Ji-hoo was confused. Why does she look irritated and accepting at the same time?
You know, this is the problem with your sparrows. You and your stupid face.
If there's a problem, just say it and accept help.
What's the point in holding on to useless pride? Tisk. Yu-il took the opportunity and really went off.
What did you say?
Of course, the Sky Fairy didn't sit still.
Sparrow? Did you say what I think you just said? What if I did?
Then that is not a comment I can gloss over. I will report it during the next council meeting. Go ahead. Let's see if you can be so nonchalant about it when we're whack. Lethish she if you can be so nonchalant about it when we're bwacw. Yu-il mockingly repeated the Sky Fairy's words. Seol Ji-hoo barely held his laughter back. It was because the Sky Fairy's reddened neck was trembling frighteningly.
Isn't it funny?
This idiotic race always slurs their speech when they're worked up.
Seol Ji-hoo laughed vaguely.
Anyways, it's best you don't interact with their race if possible. Just look at how they act. Going off about internal affairs or whatnot over such a trivial matter.
Isn't it tiring?
Oh, Yue.
The Sky Fairy slammed her bowl down. After shooting up from her seat, she pointed at Seol Ji-hoo and spoke.
Human, aren't you curious why cave fairies are covering their eyes? Oh.
To be honest, he was curious.
In fact, this was one of the questions he planned to ask given the chance.
I'll tell you.
You see. Aight.
Don't be such a killjoy.
Drag her away.
As soon as Yu-il gave the command, the 10 cave fairies all shot up and dragged the Sky Fairy away.
Wait. Let go of me. Let go of me this instant. The Sky Fairy struggled desperately. Okay, I get it.
Let me get my noodles at least.
Ah. Hey. Get your hand off that bowl now.
During all this chaos, one of the cave fairies sneaked off and was stealing the Sky Fairy's noodles.
That's mine. I was savoring each bite. Uup. Uup.
The Sky Fairy's scream subsided soon. After the short uproar.
All right. Let's get back to the topic. Yu-il spoke as if nothing had ever happened. Seol Ji-hoo put his hand over his forehead.
It felt like a storm had just passed by. There is a simple reason they hold a ritual.
For communication.
Communication?
According to the Sky Fairies, there is a powerful spirit slumbering inside the Pagoda of Dreams. Yu-il suddenly asked. Did you know that the Sky Fairies lost their spirit power?
Spirit power? Now that you mention it, I heard the communication between the Sky Fairies and the spirit realm cut off recently.
Teresa, who was standing nearby, slid into the conversation. Seol Ji-hoo asked.
Something like that happened? Yes, but I don't know much about what happened.
Since when? I think it was right after we came back from the Delphinian Duchy.
Right. The Sky Fairies were definitely using their spirit power while they were fleeing from the parasites in the Forest of Denial.
Yu-il confirmed right away.
It was a huge incident at the time. The Sky Fairies' battle power has more than halved because of it.
This was indeed the case.
The significance of the Sky Fairies' existence came from their ability to summon elemental spirits. Without this ability, the Sky Fairies were nothing more than dexterous archers.
To be honest, there have been cases in the past where the communication became unstable.
That's why the Federation transferred us in a hurry.
Isn't it surprising?
They might share a common ancestry, but for the two hostile races of Sky Fairies and Cave Fairies to become partners? 3. That just goes to show how desperate they've become.
I see. So this was the backstory. Seol Ji-hoo finally understood the background story of the conversation Ian and Dylan had in the past. Teresa spoke up. Can you provide more details on what happened?
From what I know, something happened when the parasite's 7th Army commander invaded the spirit realm under the Queen's orders. But that only made the summoning unstable.
It never cut off the communication entirely. At least, not until very recently.
You're right.
When I heard the rumors, I thought the 7th Army commander won the war in the spirit realm. But in that case, Twisted Kindness should have returned to the middle world already. 4.
But no one has seen him yet. That is most likely the case.
Yu-jin replied calmly.
The reason is simple. The spirit realm hasn't lost yet.
Perhaps they are in the middle of a fierce battle even as we speak. Teresa's face seemed to be asking, what the hell does that mean?
What Yu-jin was saying just didn't make sense.
It was then that Yu-jin suddenly turned serious.
After pondering for a long time, she started with the words, "It shouldn't matter since it is an open secret in the Federation."
The Pagoda of Dreams is a ruin from hundreds of years ago. She suddenly changed the topic. However, Sol Jihu quietly listened in.
He had a feeling that everything Yu-jin was about to say would connect together.
I don't know the details either.
But at the time, the Empire was facing an unprecedented threat.
She pointed backward with her thumb. Due to the pagoda you're trying to reach.
A pagoda that almost drove the powerful Empire to ruin?
Sol Jihu swallowed hard.
As I said before, going near the pagoda afflicts you with a powerful, contagious curse.
And that curse makes you dream. Yu-jin lowered her arm.
To be more precise, the curse delves into the minds of living beings, regardless of their race, and makes them dream what they fear most.
Dream?
You mean, nightmare? Sol Jihu asked, clearly wondering what was wrong with having a simple nightmare. How could it be a simple nightmare?
Yu-jin grinned,
then turned to face Teresa. You asked why the communication cut off, right?
Yes.
This happened very recently. The Sky Fairies learned that a powerful spirit was sleeping inside the Pagoda of Dreams and immediately left to explore the place.
Yu-jin continued.
Because the spirit realm requested assistance.
Teresa's eyes widened.
Assistance? The spirit realm did? They said Twisted Kindness' assault was getting harder to withstand and requested for help in whatever way possible.
Teresa's jaw dropped at Yu-jin's explanation. Dear God. I know that the 7th Army commander is the last dragon, but how could he single-handedly? Twisted Kindness doesn't even have his own army.
Who knows?
Yu-jin shrugged.
I've never fought him. Anyways, with the summoning getting more and more unstable by the passing day, the Sky Fairies rightfully grew anxious. That's when they discovered the Pagoda of Dreams and figured they should awaken the powerful spirit and send it over to the spirit realm to help.
With that, Yu-jin crossed her arms.
And immediately after they started exploring the pagoda, their communication with the spirit realm cut off completely. All in a single morning. Sol Jihu blinked dazedly.
He felt like there was a huge jump in the story. No. That wasn't the case. There had to be a reason Yu-jin talked about the pagoda. Sol Jihu calmly organized the story.
Nightmare, curse, spirit realm, sky fairy.
Soon, Sol Jihu connected the dots and widened his eyes.
Don't tell me.
He quickly asked.
That morning, when the Sky Fairies attempted to explore the Pagoda of Dreams, was failing to summon the spirits what the Sky Fairies feared the most.
You have fantastic intuition.
One corner of Yu-jin's mouth curled up. You're right. The reason the Pagoda of Dreams is so frightening is that it goes beyond making you dream what you most fear to making that dream a reality. That is what the Federation has discovered, and that is why they have forbidden its members from entering it.
Yu-jin acknowledged what happened and stared at Sol Jihu straightforwardly.
That is why I advised you to go back.
1. Google Korean banquet noodles, janchi guksu. 2. Mukbang. Mukbang or mukbang is an online live audiovisual broadcast, where a host eats food while interacting with the audience. It is usually done through a webcast, and it became popular in South Korea in 2010. Info from Wikipedia. 3. From Chapter 53. 4. This term is never really explained, but it is the same as material realm, paradise. Chapter 213.
Yu-jin finished her story with the Federation banning its members from entering the Pagoda of Dreams premises after that incident. They had judged that it was better to not risk anything, lest something they feared happened again.
This is everything we know about the Pagoda of Dreams. We wouldn't be able to tell you more about it even if we wanted to. That was the end of her story. Sol Ji-hoo asked a few more questions before expressing his gratitude and getting up.
He went back to the tent to relay the story to his comrades. Once he said everything without leaving out a single detail, a grave expression fell on everyone's face.
Hey! How come the expeditions you come up with are all like this? Even Cho-hong, who prided herself in being fearless, was uncomfortable with going.
A contagious nightmare, and nightmares becoming reality.
Kazuki sighed, his head dropped and his arms crossed. Can we get some of the veil that the Sky Fairy was covering herself in?
It looked like it had the power to resist the curse. Sol Ji-hoo shook his head.
I asked about that too,
but Yu-jin said it was only a temporary countermeasure. Apparently, it can block the curse seeping out of the pagoda for a moment.
Yeah, I figured.
Kazuki conceded gravely and then raised his head.
We have the choice of going back and returning with Invidia's priest. Eva is well known for its priests, so it shouldn't be difficult to find one who is well versed in lifting curses and witchcraft.
I don't know. Even the Federation gave up on lifting this curse.
I'm not sure if even a unique Rancor priest can lift it. While it sounded like Sol Ji-hoo was being pessimistic, he was being reasonable as well. It was hard to believe that a large nation formed by the union of 5 races didn't have a single power on par with a unique Rancor. Not to mention, the Federation had once treated this matter with utmost importance. In that case, can't we just not sleep during the expedition? It might be difficult, but everyone should be fine with staying awake for a day or two.
We can endure it no matter how drowsy we get, come out, then fall asleep after being touched by that black tree branch.
Hugo gave his opinion carefully, but no one reacted to it positively. In the first place, limiting sleep during an expedition was an extremely dangerous thing to do. Furthermore, this solution seemed too simple to be the right answer. It wasn't as if the Federation was stupid. There was no way they wouldn't have thought of such a method.
They must have given up either due to the sheer danger of the pagoda or due to there being really no other option.
And to be honest, Sol Ji-hoo couldn't help but think that the answer was the latter.
Deciding that sitting around debating the matter wouldn't result in a clever solution, Sol Ji-hoo decided to wrap up the meeting for the time being.
We'll continue for now. We'll decide once we get there.
He now had only one thing to rely on, the 9 eyes.
He had decided to never rely on it again after the war.
However, he wasn't left with any other choice. After the meeting ended, Sol Ji-hoo had a hard time falling asleep in his sleeping bag.
I guess it can't be helped. He remembered what Samuel said. Not every expedition proves to be a success, you see. Many times I returned with nothing to show for all our near-death experiences, and I lost count the number of times I had to give up near the end because we weren't strong enough. Because there was no ruin after they arrived. Because they weren't amply prepared. Because it was unimaginably risky. It was a common occurrence for expedition teams to come back empty-handed due to such reasons. You should remember this if you want to form your own expedition someday. You should go on one only when you have the financial leeway. An expedition isn't something on which you bet everything you have. It was just as Samuel said. It was foolish to risk danger when this wasn't the only place where the Rothschilds' inheritance was buried. Sol Ji-hoo witnessed through Samuel's team what happens when one became blinded by treasures that were right in front of them. He refused to follow in their footsteps. And so, he steeled his mind. Or rather, he set a standard for himself. To retreat if the pagoda was either orange, red, or black. Yellow was the only color he would continue the expedition with.
Because, attention required, meant there was a way out.
Any other color of danger is too much.
Since the ironclad rule of paradise was to preserve one's life first and foremost, he was sure his comrades would accept his decision.
I wonder what color the pagoda of dreams will be.
Sol Ji-hoo couldn't decide until he unknowingly fell asleep, whether he wanted it to be orange or worse, or yellow or the colors of the right direction.
Asterisk.
Sol Ji-hoo woke up in the middle of the night and was extremely taken aback.
For some reason, Yu-il was right in front of him, looking down with an expressionless face.
As if that wasn't enough, his face was buried in her bosom.
He simply couldn't understand how this came to be.
But as this wasn't the first time such a thing had happened to him, he maintained his composure on the outside.
He then got down on all fours and apologized. "I'm sorry." He heard Yu-il chuckle. "I was surprised to see you crawling into my tent in the middle of the night. I thought you're a wild rabbit at first. So sorry. My body sometimes moves against my will. I thought for sure you would pounce me once you infiltrated my sleeping bag like flowing water. But you just slept like a baby."
With an extremely satisfied face, to boot.
It was then that he realized he was in the cave fairy's tent, not his. "Well, it was fun looking at your face, so I let it be. You were rather persistent as well." When he stole a glance up, he saw Yu-il slowly putting on her jacket. Now that he got a good look, her breasts boasted quite a volume. "I was wondering why my head was so comfortable." Sol Ji-hoo felt his cheeks turn hot and muttered, "How can I make up for this act?"
Yu-il, who was tying her long hair into a ponytail, glanced at Sol Ji-hoo before smirking.
"Aw,
it's nothing.
It's been a while since I got the sensation of breastfeeding. It wasn't so bad for me." She's so cool about it. He would have no words to say even if she slapped him a dozen times.
But judging from how nonchalant she was, it seemed cave fairies were very open about such things. The word breastfeeding stung him a bit, but Sol Ji-hoo was touched by Yu-il's mercy.
"By the way,
what did you decide to do?
I saw you guys talking until late at night." When Yu-il tilted her head left and right, her ponytail fluttered. Sol Ji-hoo slowly got up from his seat. "We're going to decide after getting there."
So you're going, after all?"
She sounded a bit regretful.
"Did your comrades not say anything? They said they were okay with this."
Yu-il started.
"Oh.
They must trust you a lot." "Well, it's no surprise, given your achievements. Will it be okay?" He wasn't asking about the danger of the pagoda of dreams. He was asking whether the Federation was okay with it.
After all, there was a chance that the Federation would be affected if a nightmare came to reality.
"I'm not so sure." Yu-il tilted her head slightly.
"I personally prefer that you don't go.
I've taken a liking to you.
But if you want to go, I have no right to stop you." Yu-il spoke straightforwardly, then turned to the tent where the expedition team was sleeping.
"From the Federation's point of view, I think it doesn't matter all that much. After all, you're humans."
Sol Ji-hoo, who was staring blankly, smiled bitterly.
She was saying that it was unlikely for humans to affect the Federation since it was already rare for humans to sincerely worry about them. Well, Haremark's princess might be different. But I'm sure she's most worried about her kingdom's fate. I'm sure the Federation will be fine. Right?
Sol Ji-hoo had no choice but to accept this bitter reality.
Anyways, if you must go, why not receive a little help?
Pardon?
When Sol Ji-hoo shot his head up,
Yu-il gave a bland smile. Don't expect anything big.
Like I said yesterday, I already told you everything I know.
No one knows what's inside the pagoda or what will happen to anyone who enters. After all, not a single member of the Sky Fairy's elite expedition team made it out alive.
She then pointed at the expedition team's tent.
But, supposing that you do make it out, it would be a waste of time and effort if you're infected. Sol Jihu finally understood what Yuiril was getting at.
Try asking. Personally, I don't think she will refuse. This will be a good chance for you to get closer to the Sky Fairies as well.
You said yesterday that we shouldn't involve ourselves with them because they're tiring.
I was kidding, of course. Yuiril giggled while smacking Sol Jihu's shoulder.
We cave fairies might not have the best relationship with the Sky Fairies, but as you know, we don't have the leeway to be fighting over our feelings.
Right.
Just like the saying, adversity makes strange bedfellows. No matter how much one resented and detested someone else, cooperating in front of a powerful enemy was obvious. Sol Jihu suddenly became envious of the Federation.
Got it.
After expressing his gratitude, Sol Jihu left Yuiril's tent and went to find the Sky Fairy.
She was lying atop a tree, reaching her hand out to a chirping bird.
She must have felt Sol Jihu's presence as she lowered her arm and turned around.
Sol Jihu stopped a good distance away and explained the situation.
That his team might be entering the Pagoda of Dreams, and whether she could wait nearby with the purifying tree branch. The Sky Fairy listened quietly before speaking with a clear voice.
I understand. Sure.
Just like Yuiril said, the Sky Fairy agreed easily. The branch of the World Tree is the Sky Fairy's treasure, but I properly got the permit to use it. The branch of the World Tree?
Plus, in the 1 in 1,000 chance you manage to succeed, it will be of great help to the Federation.
Is the Federation in a difficult situation because of the Pagoda of Dreams?
No one likes having a danger zone in their front yard.
The Sky Fairy replied simply.
Another problem is that we have to take a roundabout way whenever we go to Tiggle Fortress. Anyways, waiting a day or two shouldn't be difficult. I don't see a reason to refuse.
The Sky Fairy lightly jumped down from the tree.
Also, I will provide you flower robes and stimulants.
Flower robes? It's the robe I am wearing. The Sky Fairy touched her slightly burnt white robe. Sol Jihu's eyes widened. You don't need to thank me. The previous expedition team made more preparations than this before they entered.
Yet none of them managed to return. In other words, the robes and whatever else they prepared had been ineffective. Still, having them couldn't hurt. Thank you. No problem. You're.
The Sky Fairy blurred the end of her speech, then glanced at Sol Jihu.
There was something that Sol Jihu still didn't understand completely. And that was how amazing and incredible his slaying of Undying Diligence was.
It was something no one had ever accomplished since the appearance of the Seven Armies.
Even Jang Maldong, who experienced all sorts of hardships, battles, and street fights, had called this a legendary feat. While Sol Jihu was the person behind this absurdity, he stopped thinking much of it now that the war ended. Perhaps this was what was most fearsome about Sol Jihu.
Because this meant he only saw the Seven Armies, whom the Parasite Queen put her heart and soul into creating, as mere obstacles to be overcome.
It was no wonder this Sky Fairy was taking such interest in him.
In fact, it would be hard to find anyone in the Federation who wouldn't be interested, except perhaps the Beastmen who opposed humans. As you know, this cooperation request isn't something that was originally in my schedule.
Right.
I only brought enough food for how long I thought I'd stay here, so I'm currently all out of food. Sol
Jihu wanted to ask, didn't you eat my banquet noodles yesterday? Shouldn't you have food left then? But he decided to just listen. So when you come out alive, I would like to receive a portion of your rations. Sol Jihu nodded immediately. That's easy. We brought a lot of dried bread and jerky, so you can have those now if you'd like. And no, that's not it. The Sky Fairy waved her hand in a fluster. She seemed rather anxious for some reason. After a long lull, she abruptly dropped her head and murmured quietly. Yesterday's noodles.
Yes.
Mine got stolen before I could finish them, and it's been weighing on my mind. She twiddled her thumbs before raising her head with a dry cough.
Then, she shouted boldly.
I think it's reasonable to ask for this much given what I'm de-woeing.
Sol Ji-hoo nodded his head with a wry expression. Yes. Well, if it's only banquet noodles, you can have as much as you want. Really?
The Sky Fairy rejoiced.
Then can I have 2, no, 3 bowls? Or even 4?
She clasped her hands and jumped in delight. Seeing the Sky Fairy's sharp, thin ears flapping crazily, Sol Ji-hoo scratched his head.
Was it that good?
Somehow, things turned out well whenever food was involved.
Is it gluttony, Gyula's influence? This thought crossed his mind, but he laughed it off in the next moment, thinking it was too absurd.
Asterisk.
Breakfast started in a quiet atmosphere as everyone had a lot to think about.
Sol Ji-hoo noticed several pairs of eyes stealing glances at him. He especially noticed Phi Sora, who was nibbling on her spoon with her head down. She must have remembered the ancient emperor's villa expedition.
Sol Ji-hoo didn't dare to forget about that expedition either. It was a prime example of one's wrong choice not only killing everyone, but negatively influencing paradise as well. Feeling more pressure thinking that the same might happen to him, Sol Ji-hoo vowed to follow through with the standard he set last night.
After breakfast,
a guest visited the expedition team while they were cleaning up the campsite.
It was Hareo and Heia's mother. Hareo. Hiya. Mom. Seeing the two sisters embracing their mother put a smile on Sol Ji-hoo's face. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The Foxman sisters' mother even cried and bowed. That was it.
She turned around as soon as the girls were back in her hands. Even Hareo and Heia were surprised by how quickly she turned back.
Let's go back.
Hurry.
Now?
Of course. Do you have any idea how worried everyone is? Prepare to get a huge scolding when you get back.
Mom. The sisters continued to look back as they were dragged away.
Although the mother expressed her gratitude, it felt like a simple show of formality, and she seemed more interested in avoiding this place. Some races of the Federation do not like humans. Beastmen are especially like that.
Yuirol explained with a wry expression.
Sol Ji-hoo nodded his head without a word. He knew he was lucky to have met the cave fairies. He didn't think for 1 second that he would be welcomed by everyone.
Now then, shall we get going?
Yuirol gestured with her chin. We'll guide you, if you're fine with us leaving afterwards. Thank you.
Sol Ji-hoo didn't say no.
Asterisk.
Here it is. The sun was now in the middle of the sky after the group set off in the morning.
Yuirol, who was leading the way, stopped on a patch of grass.
This is the safe zone.
A bit further ahead, you'll find the place where the Sky Fairies held their ritual. In other words, beyond this point was where the Pagoda of Dreams' influence reached.
How is it?
It doesn't look all that different from here, huh?
Just like Yuirol said, there wasn't much information to be gathered from this place.
Only trees and shrubbery filled the area, just like the areas they crossed to get here. If he had to point something out that was different, it would be the air. The air was no longer refreshing and cool, but damp and unpleasant. Of course, he might just be imagining things. Go on if it's yellow or a color of the right direction. Immediately turn back if it isn't. Sol Ji-hoo reiterated his vow and walked forward with deep breaths. He then roused his mana and activated his future gauging 9 eyes. Soon.
Quote exclamation mark quote.
Sol Ji-hoo's eyes shot wide open as he stared straight forward. Chapter 214.
Sol Ji-hoo froze up on the spot. Standing around with a dazed expression, he scanned the area with a dumbfounded look. There are 2 colors?
Right. Sol Ji-hoo's eyes were showing him 2 colors, yellow and blue. The 2 colors mixed together like paint dissolved in water and undulated in front of Sol Ji-hoo's sight.
This wasn't the first time an object shone in the color of the right direction. He had experienced the same thing twice before, once at the Valley Fortress and once at the ancient emperor's villa. The problem was that this was the first time that two colors showed up simultaneously. Setting, attention required, aside. How was he supposed to interpret choice of destiny, blending with it? Just as Sol Ji-hoo's mind was thrown into disarray, he heard someone call out his name.
"What do you want to do?" It was Cho-hong's voice. Sol Ji-hoo sighed inwardly and touched his pendant. Maybe there's some sort of a mechanism in place to help whoever came to find the inheritance. For example, a safety measure of some sort. Maybe that's why this place is shining blue. As this was something only Sol Ji-hoo knew, he couldn't be blamed for thinking this. However, he shook his head in the next moment. Being optimistic in such a dangerous, uncertain situation couldn't be good. Floan only said that the pendant stored the coordinates of the hidden inheritance. She didn't say anything more. In the end, there was only one pathway left. After deliberating for a long time, he decided to follow through with last night's decision. "We'll proceed." A look of unease flashed across everyone's face. Phi Sora looked especially tense, still not having overcome her trauma. Sol Ji-hoo quietly watched his comrades getting ready to enter before speaking. "I'll add one more condition. If you don't feel at ease, you're free to wait outside. I won't fault you or pick a problem with it. I promise." The 7 members of the expedition team, excluding Sol Ji-hoo, exchanged glances. Cho-hong then snorted. "The hell is that? Now that we're on an expedition, we gotta act together. That's how it is, isn't it? Members of an expedition share the same fate." Kazuki chimed in. "You're not wrong, but you have to understand, given the uniqueness of this ruin. But still, I won't argue since the leader gave his approval. Anyone's free to stay out. But don't forget, you won't be included in sharing any of the loot." Kazuki put the nail in the coffin by flicking in a stimulant he got from Sol Ji-hoo into his mouth. Then, the signs of hesitation vanished. Everyone took the stimulant, put on the flower robe, and lit up their eagerness to go ahead. It was easy to see that everyone was anxious. But they were clearly shaking their fears off because of Sol Ji-hoo's declaration to proceed. After all, he had turned nearly impossible missions into dazzling successes several times. Sol Ji-hoo didn't reveal anything on the outside, but his team members' expectations felt heavier on his shoulders than usual. At last, seeing Phi Sora getting ready to enter, Sol Ji-hoo turned back to the front. "I should thank my lucky stars it isn't orange or worse." No matter how much he tried to maintain his focus, he couldn't deny feeling anxious. This was the first time he was carrying out an expedition without a single clue. Kazuki walked to the front. "Can I go?" Sol Ji-hoo nodded his head. "I wish you luck." With Yuirol's parting words behind, the expedition team marched forward. The conquering of the Pagoda of Dreams began. Just like Yuirol said, the expedition team found traces of the Sky Fairy's attempted communication soon after marching in. Because nothing seemed out of the ordinary, the team simply passed by it. The forest was eerily silent, and the expedition team's mood sunk more the deeper they went in. Maria, who was looking around the greenery, rubbed her arms and shuddered. "What a creepy place," Cho-hong retorted, continually wetting her lips with her saliva. "Fuck. I'd rather risk my life to fight parasites than this." Two extremes were more or less the same. An area swarming with monsters was bad, but so was an area that was too bleak and desolate. Given the forest's current atmosphere, no one would be surprised if something suddenly popped out of the woods. As the expedition team walked further in, the indescribable anxiousness they were feeling exhausted their tense minds. The severity of the atmosphere made it seem as if whoever created this place was aiming for this effect. Cho-hong raised her voice in an attempt to shake off this pressure. "Kazuki, can you sense anything?" "Nothing." Kazuki gave a short reply.
If what the Federation said is true, there should be nothing in this area. Not even the undead? Unsightly humility should be recuperating, so it's unlikely that the undead army is here.
Plus, we can't eliminate the possibility of the undead being able to dream.
As long as they have their own will, that is. What? Undeads don't even sleep. Then you force them to dream. Kazuki spoke firmly.
He had a point. Since animals other than humans could also dream, it wasn't so impossible for the undead to dream.
But that wasn't something the expedition team should be happy about. The pagoda's curse had already reached them and was enveloping their bodies.
Their half-burnt flower robes were more than enough evidence. Sol Jihu activated the blessing of the circum just in case and immediately furrowed his brows.
The tri-circular shield shattered just 4 seconds after it was produced. It was clear that the curse was getting stronger the closer they got to its source.
The forest grew darker the deeper they marched into it. Large trees blocked the sunlight from shining down, making the tree trunks and leaves look dark.
The biggest problem, however, was a hazy, fog-like smoke that impaired their vision.
Would it be right to describe this as walking between clouds?
Perhaps Sol Jihu was mistaken, but he felt his mind growing dim and struggled to keep himself sharp. The stimulant must be doing its job as he could quickly clear up his foggy mind. Trying not to let his guard down, Sol Jihu chanted inwardly.
Please let us get out of here safely.
How much time went by? Kazuki suddenly gave the stop signal after walking non-stop for a long time.
Sol Jihu stepped forward, calming his beating heart down.
What's up? Kazuki didn't say anything for a while even though he was the one who called Sol Jihu.
He narrowed his eyes, then murmured quietly.
Something strange.
Presence. No.
Even though they're not moving, I feel a large number of something surrounding us. What he said sounded strange if one only heard it briefly.
He said they were surrounded by unmoving things, but Sol Jihu couldn't see anything when he scoured the area. Almost like statues.
Kazuki muttered to himself before biting down on his lip. His slightly distorted expression clearly showed that he was vexed.
It would have been nice to tell everyone about it more clearly. He was the expedition's header, so he was frustrated at himself for being unable to even relay information properly when they entrusted the role to him.
His ability was lacking, strictly speaking, but no one mocked Kazuki for it.
Kazuki was one of the best pathfinders in Harem.
If even Kazuki was confused, the result would have been similar no matter who they brought along. Kazuki grit his teeth and continued. That's not all.
I feel a powerful aura up ahead.
This was something even Sol Jihu could sense. To be more precise, he had been feeling it ever since Kazuki began to speak.
Hold on, everyone.
Wait here. What are you trying to do? Let me walk up just a little bit.
Sol Jihu walked forward by himself.
It was extremely dangerous given their severe lack of information, but he had something he wanted to try. Before anyone noticed, the fog had gotten so dense that it was severely impairing everyone's vision. Sol Jihu couldn't see anything either, but he tapped on his pendant.
A black smoke flowed out as if it had been waiting.
Sol Jihu asked quietly.
Flown, can you feel anything?
After a moment, the top of the smoke shook.
She seemed to be saying, no.
Sol Jihu asked again. Then, can you fly forward and see what's up ahead?
Just a little bit is fine.
Sol Jihu couldn't help but be sorry as he carefully made this request. In a way, he was using the fact that Flown was a ghost to dump a dangerous task at her.
That should be easy. Flown must have been listening to Kazuki's explanation as she accepted without any unnecessary questions. Sorry. Just a peek is fine, so don't push yourself. Okay.
Don't worry about it.
The black smoke flew forward like flowing water and disappeared.
He heard someone calling his name from behind, but he raised his hand to tell them he was okay and waited for Flown.
What's taking her so long?
Given Flone's speed and the distance she was traveling, she should already be back.
Plus, we can't eliminate the possibility of the undead being able to dream.
As long as they have their own will, that is. As he grew nervous, remembering Kazuki's words, a black smoke cut through the fog and reappeared.
Sol Jihu barely held himself back from shouting. "Flone, are you okay?" There wasn't anything out of the ordinary. Flone whispered in a ladylike manner. "I didn't see anything special. Well, other than a pile of rocks that was shining blue."
A pile of rocks?
Yeah, it looked like this. The black smoke flew down and drew a picture on the dirt. 2 headstones were standing vertically and a large flat stone was sitting horizontally on top of them. The entire structure looked just like a dolmen. It looked kind of odd, so I flew over and poked it, but nothing happened.
Sol Jihu smiled bitterly.
He had told her to only take a look, but it seemed curiosity had gotten the better of her.
"Should I go break it?"
No, it's fine." Sol Jihu stopped Flone.
The problem was that he didn't know what the pile of rocks was. Breaking the stone structure would be great if it resulted in the fog or the curse lifting, but it could also be the same as poking a beehive. As no one knew what result it would bring forth, it was best not to touch it so recklessly. Sol Jihu returned to the expedition team. "A dolmen that's shining blue?"
When he explained what Flone told him, Kazuki gave him a strange look.
"How did you see?"
"I still can't see anything with my eyes." You didn't even go that far out."
Sol Jihu let them know about the dolmen since now wasn't the time to hide any information, but he was still hesitant to reveal Flone. It is then that Chohong suddenly spoke.
"Oh right, what was that about?"
During the war. You flew in the air.
You said you'd tell me after the war. Arg, I've forgotten about it until now. Chet, I got tricked."
"Tricked?" Sol Jihu smiled bitterly.
His comrades did not know about Flone yet.
A part of the reason was how secretive Flone was, but the main reason was that she hated revealing herself.
Even last night, when the team was having banquet noodles, Flone had gone off by herself to eat in secret. Sol Jihu suggested many times for Flone to introduce herself to the team, but she flew off whenever he brought up the topic. The reason was rather silly as well. She said she was too embarrassed. She can't hide herself forever. It really looked like Flone was just embarrassed, so Sol Jihu decided to introduce her once and for all after the expedition. But since they were in the middle of an expedition right now, he only revealed the necessary bits. When he explained how Flone came to accompany him, everyone's expressions turned strange. And when he mentioned that she was the evil ghost from the Forest of Denial's tomb, Chohong and Hugo let out loud gasps. What? T the ghost that killed Samuel's team? Stop. Kazuki cut Chohong off. We'll listen to the full story later. We're in the middle of an expedition right now. He then turned to Sol Jihu. I know you have your own thoughts as the leader. I'm not trying to intrude on your authority, but I think it would have been better if you told us about her sooner. That way, we would have been able to check if the curse affected ghosts as well when the Sky Fairy lifted the curse for us, and she could have scouted for us too. Sol Jihu dropped his jaw at Kazuki's perfectly logical argument. He had indeed not thought that far. Sorry. She just hates showing herself in front of others. I guess it can't be helped then. Kazuki slowly closed his eyes. He seemed to be organizing his thoughts. After a brief moment of silence, Kazuki opened his eyes and asked. So to sum it up, you asked this ghost to scout what's up ahead? Yes. This is a ghost, not a human. Kazuki seemed to be focused on the fact that Flone was a ghost rather than the dolmen she discovered. Sol Jihu was having similar thoughts. Yes, but her ego and consciousness is crystal clear. She's no different than a human. She even sleeps periodically. What an interesting ghost.
What? What are you suggesting here? Is there a rule that says a ghost shouldn't sleep? Have you tried being dead?
Floan fumed from inside the pendant.
Of course, only Sol Jihu could hear her, and Kazuki smacked his lips.
Looks like we have no choice but to keep going.
We can't treat humans and ghosts the same, but we don't really have a choice. Sol Jihu agreed with this statement.
Yes, I think so too. Once the leader and the header came to an agreement, the expedition team began to march forward again. No, just as they were about to start.
Oh!
Phi Sora's shrill voice grabbed everyone's attention. She was looking down at the ground with her right foot raised and with a bewildered expression.
What's wrong? And nothing.
I think I stepped on something.
Sol Jihu examined the thicket carefully, but he didn't see anything strange. You sure you aren't just imagining it?
No, I definitely felt something. Phi Sora tilted her head, then moved away as if it was unpleasant. After this short happening, the expedition team slowly marched forward. Not long afterwards, they began to see a bluish glow, just like Floan said. The light became brighter the deeper they went in until their surroundings were half fog, half light. Finally, when they could vaguely see the pile of rocks from the distance, Kazuki, who was standing at the front, leaned back and whispered, "I think that's it."
It was then.
Pot. While everyone was looking straight forward, the dolmen-like pile of rocks burst into blue light.
What? Sol Jihu shut his eyes reflexively as if a camera flash had gone off in front of him. Intense dizziness instantly swept through his head.
Ah! Starting with Floan, several groans rang out.
Sol Jihu felt his body sway.
He immediately opened his eyes and looked around the area.
Everyone was squinting or covering their eyes with their hands.
Other than that, he didn't see anything strange. Nothing really caught his attention either. When he looked down, wondering if anything happened to his body.
Quote! Sol Jihu blinked quickly. The pendant, which had turned black after Floan's liberation, was glowing brightly.
And in the same shade of blue as the dolmen. Chapter 215.
Intense light exploded out of the pile of stones, and the pendant began glowing with the same color in response.
The two objects madly began pulsing as if they were resonating with each other.
But that was it. Sol Jihu waited a bit, expecting some sort of phenomenon, but the dolmen and the pendant just continued to blink. A dead silence continued in the area. Murmuring amongst each other, the expedition team approached the stones.
Upon closer inspection, the rocks were normal stones, erected in the form of a dolmen. There were no symbols on their surfaces. They were just ordinary stones.
Should we try digging?
Cho Hong suddenly suggested.
It looks just like a dolmen.
Meaning, this might be a tomb of some sort.
Won't there be grave goods buried underneath them?
It was a good idea, especially considering that it was Cho Hong who said it. After all, artifacts were commonly buried beneath the ground. Sol Jihu decided that it was a reasonable suggestion and instructed the others to try digging around the stones. The expedition team started to dig without complaint. A moment later, "Hoo-ah!"
Hugo exclaimed. Sol Jihu, who had been digging the ground with his spear, lifted his eyes. Hugo was prancing around with a long spear in one hand. It's a spear. A spear. Doesn't it look crazy expensive?
Then Teresa also shouted, "Kya! A chest!
It's a treasure chest."
Sol Jihu's eyes widened. Jackpot. The results of digging the area could be summed up in that one word. It was the biggest jackpot in the history of paradise.
Not to mention the spear of purity, there were numerous treasure chests overflowing with gold and silver. If they included the offerings and decorations they found, the total value was simply immeasurable. After making a fuss over their harvest, the expedition team left the Pagoda of Dreams with smiles on their faces. They hadn't seen a pagoda of any sort, nor had they seen anything that resembled a small tower, but it wasn't important. They had achieved a jaw-dropping result, so was a mere pagoda even worth mentioning anymore?
And so the expedition team safely returned from the Forbidden Region, received purification from the Sky Fairy, bid farewell to Uiral, then embarked on their way back home. Their bags were heavy, but their footsteps were light. Wanting to return as quickly as possible, the expedition team marched for a long time before finally stopping late at night to set up camp. That night, Cho Hong stroked a treasure chest while speaking with a dreamy face. "What should I do first when I arrive?" "He. I'm buying equipment. I'm going straight to the auction house at Scheherazade to plaster my whole body with the most expensive equipment I can find." Hugo passionately shouted like a boy lost in his dreams. The expedition team ate and drank merrily until early in the morning, each of them chirping about what they would do with the expedition rewards. When morning came, the expedition team's atmosphere plummeted down to an all-time low. No, it was better described as a powder keg on the brink of an explosion. There was just one reason. Only a single night had passed, but all their spoils from the Pagoda of Dreams had disappeared like magic. Everything was gone without a single gold coin remaining. The culprit was Maria Yeriel. It could only be her, since she couldn't be found anywhere when they had woken up. Is this for real? Cho Hong exploded with anger. That priest bitch ran off with all of that? Is that bitch fucking crazy? It's not impossible. Kazuki remarked with a solemn face. She could have had a high-quality magic bag with her. It wouldn't be surprising if she did, since she always hoards money like a Scrooge. Fuck. That little good-for-nothing bitch. She's still nothing but a flea even if she scampers away. She dares to run away with the expedition rewards? The moment I catch her, her head will… Ah! Cho Hong clenched her grip around the thorn of steel with red eyes. There's no time for this. Kazuki! What are you doing? Hurry up and track her. Of course. Kazuki replied in a cold voice before turning to look at Sol Jihu. Sol Jihu agreed with them, but his heart was in chaos. I believed in her. He knew that she loved money with a maniacal obsession, but he still thought she was a loyal person. Miss Maria. The expedition team pursued Maria in full force. They were gaining on her at first, but after a day, they could only give up. Her tracks disappeared. To be exact, Maria's footsteps were gone, replaced by endless carriage tracks. She must have gotten lucky and hitched a ride on a passing carriage. The despondency that the expedition team felt then could not be described in words. They combed through the city like they were catching fleas once they arrived at Eva, just in case, but sure enough, they could not find even a single hair of Maria's. Whether she returned to Earth or left for a different city. She had vanished. In the end, the expedition team gave up the pursuit and got on their way back to Haramark under a dispirited mood. It was an obvious fact, but the complexions of the company were not too good. Sol Jihu tried to rouse himself by constantly reminding himself that it was only one part of the inheritance and that there were still 4 remaining. But what was waiting at Haramark for the Carpe Diem Guild was only tragic news like a bolt out of the blue. It was the news of Xiao Yuhui, Zhang Maldong, and the Yi siblings' deaths. Xiao Yuhui had been ambushed while she was praying at the temple and was brutally murdered. Zhang Maldong and the Yi siblings were found dead at the huge stone Rocky Mountain. The culprit remained unknown. By the time the expedition team had arrived, the cases were already hushed up. Sol Jihu cried. He shed tears all day long, shut away in his dorm. It wasn't as if the thought that he had to do something didn't appear in his mind, but his brain just stopped functioning from the impact of the sudden accidents. Meanwhile, his comrades started to disappear one by one. Cho Hong and Hugo left saying they were going out for revenge, and all news about them was cut from then on. Marcel Guionia and Phi Sora must have left without saying anything. They suddenly couldn't be found at one point. By the time Sol Jihu barely managed to come to his senses, he was alone. He curled up in a corner of the office and looked around the room with dull eyes.
The office that had always smelled of people and used to be bustling was now bleak and desolate. His weary face stained by tears scrunched up in distress.
No way.
How did things become like this? Sol Ji-hoo hung his head in front of the inconceivable reality.
Pathetic. He suddenly heard a familiar voice above his head. It was Teresa's voice.
Why are you like this over the death of just a few Earthlings? It's hard to believe you're a war hero. Just a few? His eyes widened. Sol Ji-hoo involuntarily opened his eyes in disbelief, unable to believe that it was Teresa who said such venomous remarks. But instead of Teresa, he found Hao Win standing in front of him. You're a complete wreck now. Hao Win turned his body around after spitting a short statement. I judged you wrong.
Sol Ji-hoo stupidly gazed at Hao Win's back leading through the door.
Not to mention catching him, he couldn't even muster the energy to call out.
Sol Ji-hoo belatedly tried to move but found that he didn't know what to do.
He finally remembered Kim Hannah and tried to call her, but she didn't pick up.
In the end, everyone had left him. The strings of relationships that he had tied in paradise were all cut away. There were no tears left in his eyes.
They're all gone. Sol Ji-hoo caressed his head.
It's a dream. He knelt and repeatedly smashed his forehead on the ground. A dream. It's all a dream. He didn't know what he was doing himself. He only yelled inside his mind that it was all a dream while slamming his head on the ground. And as Sol Ji-hoo was drowned in despair, refusing to accept reality. Hyuk.
Sol Ji-hoo jerked up from his bed in shock. Bright light prickled his eyes. He rapidly blinked, and his blurry vision gradually cleared. And as he looked around him, Sol Ji-hoo displayed a shocked expression as if there wasn't anything more absurd than what he was seeing at the moment. A crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling and several dozens of green tables.
And the numerous people sitting in front of those tables. This is Seoric land. It was the casino that Sol Ji-hoo had once frequented. While he was still dumbstruck, Sol Ji-hoo suddenly felt someone hold his arm and help him up.
Friend, you're crazy.
An aged voice. A middle-aged man was supporting his arm. It was a face he had seen a couple of times. Even if you're crazy about gambling, how could you fall asleep in the middle of a game? You have to think about others too. Sol Ji-hoo's eyes widened.
He had absolutely no clue what the man was saying.
Here.
Go and freshen yourself up with some cold air outside. Rather, it'll be good if you get some sleep.
Your eyes are bloodshot. And no.
As Sol Ji-hoo was still stuttering, the middle-aged man dragged the youth outside. After being forcibly pushed out of the casino, Sol Ji-hoo froze in place like a statue.
He pinched his cheeks, but his mind remained clear.
The cold morning air that he could feel on his skin could not feel more real.
Like the middle-aged man had said, he had fallen asleep while playing a game.
Then? A dream?
The 1 year he spent in paradise, all of it?
Everything was just a few minutes worth of a daydream? There's no way. Sol Ji-hoo hurriedly searched his pockets. But all his hands grabbed were a wallet, some coins, and his phone.
He couldn't find a piece of paper even after flipping his pockets inside out. Paradise. He tried shouting it out just in case.
He felt his chest sink.
Gula. Ira. Luxuria. Nvidia. Haramark. Scheherazade. Parasite Queen.
Due to the contract, he could not speak aloud any words related to paradise on earth. That was supposed to be the case, but he could hear all the words ring extremely clearly in his ears.
No.
This couldn't be happening. It shouldn't be like this.
Taxi. Sol Ji-hoo immediately got in the taxi and rode it to his neighborhood. But reality did not change.
He stopped in the middle to drop by the restaurant at Hanjik University Station, but Phi Sora was nowhere to be found.
Moreover, none of the employees knew of her either.
Upon returning to his old room, Sol Ji-hoo stood dazed at the sight.
A trash dump. It had been like this back when he had fallen deep into gambling. Ha ha. Ha ha ha.
His eyes became hot as he stood there, staring at the room.
Tears that he had thought were dried up began to spill down his face. Paradise didn't even exist in the first place?
A final place of refuge which Sol Jihu had barely found and where he had pieced his life together. The place where he could stay had disappeared like a mirage. That fact caused enormous and endless despair for Sol Jihu. And finally, when Sol Jihu couldn't take it anymore and hung his head after falling on his knees.
Cling! A sound of metal along with a faint sensation on his neck was felt. As Sol Jihu subconsciously looked down, a glint suddenly flashed in his eyes. A pendant was dropped in the hallway, its jewel pulsing with light. Ha!
That moment.
He! A voice he had completely forgotten slammed into his ears. Sol Jihu narrowed his eyes in reflex before holding his breath.
Get a hold of yourself.
Hurry! The shouting voice belonged to none other than Floan.
Floan?
Quickly! Hurry up! It's dangerous! He didn't understand what she was saying, but whatever it was, she sounded extremely urgent. While Sol Jihu was standing there in a daze, her voice continued.
Are you listening? Can you hear me?
Well, listen carefully.
You're thinking that the world you're in is real, right?
Ha! Well, it's not. You might think that, but that world is definitely not real.
You're inside your dream. You're currently dreaming in the middle of an expedition. Quote.
It might sound unbelievable, but you have to believe me.
Dreams are like that. You might find them ridiculous after waking up, but you don't realize that when you're inside them.
Floan was speaking extremely calmly despite talking fast.
Think carefully.
Wasn't there anything that you've experienced that didn't seem right to you?
Anything at all? Sol Jihu's mouth slowly gaped open. You can hear me, right?
Please wake up.
You're in extreme danger. You're about to die of suffocation. The pendant bounced up and down.
Sol Jihu instinctively grabbed the jewel.
Now that I think about it. He suddenly felt a strong sense of incongruity immediately after hearing Floan's words.
The pendant, for a start.
The fact that he could speak about paradise meant that he had never entered paradise.
But how was he holding onto an item from paradise? His foggy mind suddenly cleared up. And finally, all doubts disappeared from his eyes. He slowly, extremely slowly looked around the world. Starting with Floan. He wasn't denying reality like he had when he had fallen into despair in paradise. The moment he doubted his dream. Kook. Sol Jihu opened his eyes. Chapter 216.
Quote.
His cheeks hurt.
Damp fog tickled his eyes and caused them to water up.
Sol Jihu rubbed his eyes harshly. He felt like he woke up from a catnap he took in the middle of an exam period.
Are you okay?
Floan shoved her face in front of Sol Jihu. Yes. Sol Jihu replied powerlessly, then turned his gaze. This is. He could tell he was in a forest, but he couldn't see the sky. Do you think you can stand up? It was then that Sol Jihu realized he was lying down. So that's why my back felt so comfortable. He raised his upper body and immediately became dazed. Everyone was lying down on their backs or stomachs.
Their eyes were closed as if they were all sleeping.
At that moment, the bluish light flowed through the fog, glimmering in front of him once again.
Don't look.
Floan placed her hand on Sol Jihu's head and pushed it down.
Floan? The same thing happened before.
Floan shouted impatiently.
Everyone fainted when the stone suddenly shone. What?
It's true.
Everyone just plopped down one by one.
According to Floan, the expedition team had lost consciousness after seeing the light.
This had to mean that the light had the power to forcefully put people to sleep. Sol Jihu quickly turned his back on the dolmen.
What about you, Floan?
You're okay. Me?
I'm fine.
Nothing's wrong with me.
Floan didn't dream. She didn't even lose consciousness. She had proven that the curse didn't work on her.
Perhaps it was because she wasn't a living being, or perhaps it was because members of the Rothschild family were being protected somehow.
Are you sure you can just sit still? Floan asked carefully while Sol Jihu was organizing his thoughts.
Your comrades, they seem to be in danger. Though it's not as bad as you.
Sol Jihu looked around in a startle.
Just like Floan said, he could hear groans ringing out everywhere. Everyone looked sick and pale.
Uike, kook.
But there was one person in particular who seemed to be in a serious condition.
Liar, you're a liar. Phi Sora was drenched in cold sweat, murmuring in her sleep. Sol Jihu wasn't sure what she was dreaming about, but it was easy to see she was in agony.
He shot up, then paused. He had to save her, but how?
Floan, you were the one who talked to me in my dream, right?
Yeah. You heard me? Yes. How did you talk to me?
Well, I'm not sure. Floan spoke hesitantly.
Everyone suddenly collapsed, and I didn't know what to do. You didn't wake up when I shook you, and slapping your cheeks didn't work.
So that's why my cheeks hurt? Sol Jihu asked as he rubbed his chin. So I put my mouth against the pendant as a last-ditch effort and just shouted. Ah! Floan must have shouted when he was in his room wallowing in despair.
Do you have any idea how worried I was?
Your face turned pale and you suddenly had trouble breathing. While Floan grumbled quietly, Sol Jihu fell into thought. I don't have enough information. Floan, did you hear anything else about the pendant? I think it has some other secrets.
Really?
Yeah, but Grandpa stopped to tell me to run away, when he was in the middle of telling me about it. Floan spoke sulkingly. But he said to bring the pendant if we're going to go search for the inheritance. He said it would work as a lighthouse.
Lighthouse?
Yep. Even if there is an external threat, he said the promise would protect us.
Sol Jihu bit his lip. He was sure that the pendant would help them find the inheritance, but he had no way of knowing what function it had exactly. At this rate, the nightmare was getting more and more intense the longer the dream went on.
He had to hurry and wake everyone up. Kook, kook. While Sol Jihu was racking his brain for an answer, Phi Sora's breathing became irregular. Now wasn't the time to hold anything back. Sol Jihu approached Phi Sora as if to clutch at straws. He wasn't sure if it would work, but it was worth trying the same thing Floan did. And so just as he held the pendant up with his left hand and rested Phi Sora's head on his right. Peetst! An intense current of electricity flowed through his palm to his body. Ah!
He immediately experienced the feeling of freefall as if the ground vanished and he was descending into an abyss. As Floan's voice grew faint, Sol Jihu's vision instantly blackened.
Asterisk.
When light returned to his eyes, a familiar scenery was spread out in front of Sol Jihu's eyes.
An endless sandy beach and a single villa standing on a steep seaside cliff.
It was the ancient emperor's villa.
Sol Jihu was taken aback, but he soon analyzed the situation stoically. He threw his sense out the window when it came to romance, but he was rather quick-witted about things like this. It's Miss Phi Sora's dream. Sol Jihu arrived at the correct answer instantly. After all, he had touched Phi Sora's body without staring at the stone's light. He must have been sucked in when he made contact. Considering how he could be influenced by the curse, it wasn't surprising that he was experiencing something different than what Floan did. This situation wasn't so bad if his goal was to rescue Phi Sora. Rather than shouting endlessly from the outside world, it was far more efficient to appear in person and help her wake up. The only problem was that it was dangerous. I don't have much time. Phi Sora was in a dangerous state. Dilly-dallying for too long might end with the dream devouring her alive. As such, Sol Jihu immediately entered the ancient emperor's villa. He had a feeling he knew where Phi Sora was.
The inside of the villa carried a gloomy atmosphere, but Sol Jihu didn't think it was dark.
Rather, bright light spread out wherever he went and illuminated the area. Sol Jihu tilted his head, wondering,
what phenomenon is this?
His gaze then landed on the pendant. The pendant was shining several times brighter than before. Looking back, it seemed to be blinking incessantly when he was in his dream. He had just realized too late. Sol Jihu gave a bitter smile and ran forward at full speed.
As soon as he reached the 4th floor, he paused unknowingly. He had no other choice. Because the things filling up the floor hardly left any room to step forward. He could see several people, who had died during the villa expedition and were likely Phi Sora's comrades.
It's your fault. We died because of your greed.
It's all your fault. Sol Jihu doubted his ears.
Over 10 corpses were pointing their fingers at someone, spitting out spiteful, vicious comments. The evil spirits in the villa were also dancing in the air, enjoying the scene play out. It was a truly bizarre sight. And in the middle of it all was Phi Sora.
You goddamn, despicable wench. You dare to run away after killing us all?
Die. If you have any conscience left, go kill yourself. She was crying. Surrounded by the corpses,
Phi Sora was crying quietly with her face buried between her knees.
She flinched every time a hateful comment flew her way as though it was spearing her alive. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry.
Sorry? You think apologizing will fix anything?
Then,
what should I do? Didn't I just say it?
You should die too. Now.
Kill yourself painfully.
It was then that Phi Sora lifted her head slightly. I just have to die.
Then you'll forgive me.
Of course.
Of course, we'll forgive you.
Hurry, hurry. The corpse rejoiced.
Sol Jihu shouted aloud.
You can't, Miss Phi Sora. Phi Sora flinched. Raising her head and seeing Sol Jihu, she made a dumbfounded expression. Miss Phi Sora.
This is a dream.
A dream. Even so, Phi Sora only stared at him blankly.
Sol Jihu raced forward, unable to hold back his frustration. But then, he paused.
The murmurs filling up the 4th floor had subsided before he noticed. He couldn't even hear a peep.
He might be mistaken, but he felt like hundreds of pairs of eyes were glaring at him.
Crock.
Then suddenly, bone-chilling cracks rang out.
The sound was coming from the corpses' necks.
Their necks creaked 180 degrees sideways until they were all facing Sol Jihu.
Seeing their hollow eyes, Sol Jihu groaned inwardly.
A dream?
Kick.
So what if it's a dream? So what?
They sneered.
Sol Jihu's eyes narrowed.
Wait, he must have walked in here by himself. We can't let him leave then. Hee hee. Hey hey hey. They burst into creepy laughter before turning around fully. Clear hostility shot out.
You come here too.
Hee 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 hee.
Just as they began to run forward like starving hyenas.
Pot.
A brilliant light erupted from the pendant.
It was so dazzling that Sol Jihu was blinded momentarily. Next, screams rang out from all directions in a truly uproarious fashion.
Wherever the light shone, the evil spirits would writhe in agony.
Only then was Sol Jihu convinced. This pendant. Flone's grandfather had left this pendant for a future generation of the Rothschild family to find the inheritance. The Pagoda of Dreams curse worked regardless of whether one was a member of the Rothschild family or not.
However, the pendant acted as a shield protecting its holder from being afflicted by the curse. That was why it kept blinking in Sol Jihu's dream and helped him wake up through Flone's voice. Assuming that Flone was unaffected by the curse because she wasn't a living being, it all made sense. Knowing this, Sol Jihu was no longer afraid of anything.
After all, this pendant was basically a free pass in finding the Rothschild's inheritance. Alright, Miss Phi Sora.
As soon as he came to this realization, he quickly went into action.
He grabbed Phi Sora's hand and ran down the stairs swiftly. Even after leaving the first floor, Sol Ji-hoo continued to run without stopping. Although he didn't really need to run, he forcefully dragged Phi Sora out because she was so down. She was noisy as well. Wait, wait! Sol Ji-hoo stopped only after running along the sandy beach for a long time. It was because Phi Sora's legs had become limp and stumbled. Seeing Phi Sora lying face down on the ground was quite the sight to behold.
What's going on?
A dream.
This is a dream. How many times do I have to tell you? Dream?
No, I definitely. Phi Sora looked extremely confused. Sol Ji-hoo smacked his lips. He told her about the inconsistencies in this dream world, yet she didn't show any signs of waking up.
The trauma she was suffering must have blown up and influenced her mind somehow. The nightmare seemed to have eaten up her mental state quite a bit. But everything is so vivid.
Sol Ji-hoo was starting to get annoyed, but he held himself back. I was like that too.
It was just like what Floan said. Someone dreaming wouldn't necessarily feel that they were dreaming, while someone interfering in a dream would be fully aware that they were in a dream. But the fact was that he didn't have much time. The pendant would help them escape, but staying in the dream any longer than necessary wouldn't help one bit. So what should he do?
How could he break Phi Sora's nightmare? He knew how.
From his experience, Phi Sora just had to strongly deny that this world was real. Sol Ji-hoo got on one knee with patience.
He got on Phi Sora's eye level and carefully wrapped his arms around her shoulders.
Miss Phi Sora, listen carefully.
We experienced something similar in the past, right? That. Phi Sora nodded without realizing it.
Sol Ji-hoo spoke calmly with a serious face.
Try to remember. A lot has happened since then.
We met because of the Yi siblings' recruitment issue. You followed me to Carpe Diem. We fought in a war together, then met on Earth.
Phi Sora's mouth opened slightly.
Sol Ji-hoo didn't miss this reaction.
Do you remember what you told me in a fit of anger while we were eating Bude Jjigae? 1. Phi Sora's eyes shot open. Wait, now that you mention it, meeting you on Earth was
something that happened after the ancient emperor's villa incident.
Phi Sora must have realized something as she muttered to herself. Right, after the war. I was taking shifts looking after you. Then I heard that my friend committed suicide and went to Earth.
You said you went to a funeral. Sol Ji-hoo felt like he was poking at a painful memory, but there wasn't a better proof.
Phi Sora's faint eyes slowly became clearer.
Then, Phi Sora's complexion regained its color, and she muttered with a subdued voice.
Fuck, this is a dream. She spat out a curse.
Sol Ji-hoo smiled.
Right, this was Phi Sora. Since when? We can think about the details later.
You're not the only one who's asleep.
We need to hurry.
Sol Ji-hoo spoke firmly. Why don't you wake up now, Princess Phi Sora?
If it's too hard.
Nervousness blazed up inside him, but Sol Ji-hoo tried to keep a straight face and muttered shamelessly. Do you want me to give you a kiss? What?
Phi Sora's eyebrows perked up. You son of a AACK. Thwack. Kook.
As soon as Phi Sora woke up, she rolled around on the ground with Sol Ji-hoo.
She had smashed her forehead into him while getting up reflexively. You have terrible sleeping habits. Sol Ji-hoo rubbed his forehead with tears around his eyes.
Why, you're the one to speak. Phi Sora, who was also rubbing her forehead, looked around the area and became lost for words. You're right. Don't look at the stone unless you want to have another nightmare. Phi Sora quickly turned around. That's one. Sol Ji-hoo gulped. I'm sorry to tell you this right after you woke up, but we don't have much time. You see what's happening, right? Yes. You and I are the only ones who are awake right now. Everyone else must be in their nightmares. Gulp. Phi Sora's throat drew a huge gulp. She wasn't a fool. Her sharpness returned once she was back in reality, and she immediately understood what Sol Ji-hoo wanted to do. "What do I do?"
Okay, first. Ook.
Just as Sol Ji-hoo was about to explain, a short scream suddenly rang out.
Phi Sora and Sol Ji-hoo instinctively turned to the direction of the sound and saw Teresa, who was flailing her arms and convulsing. Soon. Huck. Huck.
Teresa's eyes shot open, and she spat out several rough pants. "A dream?"
She muttered blankly, then pushed herself up.
"That was a dream, right?" Seeing Teresa murmuring to herself, Sol Ji-hoo exclaimed in shock inwardly. She woke up by herself without the help of the pendant? From such a chillingly realistic nightmare? Princess? Teresa's head turned to the side. Sol? She stared dazedly, confusion still undulating in her pupils. "Are you okay?" Teresa didn't say anything. She only stared at him suspiciously. "Princess." When he called her again, Teresa suddenly curled her arms up and made a heart. "Hubby." She then shouted in a sweet, animated voice. "I love you." "Excuse me?" Sol Ji-hoo's face contorted. What the hell was this woman suddenly on about? However, Teresa didn't stop there. "Excuse me? What do you mean, excuse me?" "I said I love you." "When are you going to propose to me?" "I'm dying to get married." "Excuse me?" Phi Sora stared at her like she was looking at a crazy bitch, but Teresa paid no attention to her and continued shouting. Stop pretending to be deaf. If you make me angry, I might push you down." Now that we're on this topic, why not make a baby first? You up for it? Excuse me? After spouting nonsense 4 times in a row, Teresa stared at Sol Ji-hoo fixedly and repeated, So? Right. Next, she closed her eyes with an accepting face, then let out a sigh of relief. That's the right reaction. Quote. Now what did this mean? Teresa sprawled down and muttered. This is reality. Sol Ji-hoo became dazed. Needless to say, the curse dragged out the memory one feared the most and made them have a nightmare. In that case, just what dream did the princess have? And also, just how did she escape? 1. Korean Army Stew. Chapter 217. Sol Ji-hoo was extremely curious about Teresa's dream, but decided to focus on the immediate task at hand. I was too cautious. He now understood. He had tried not to take rash actions thinking that he lacked information, but as Floan had suggested, he should have smashed the damn stone into pieces the moment he saw it. While he couldn't be sure whether that was the correct answer or not, they would have at least not fallen into their current situation. The problem was that the mistake had already been made. There were 2 choices that Sol Ji-hoo could take now. Continue the rescue operation. Try breaking the stone. After a brief moment of contemplation, Sol Ji-hoo chose the first option. It was because there was no guarantee that breaking the stone would wake his comrades from their dreams. Of course, there was still an option to carry out both of the choices simultaneously, but he had to keep in mind the possibility of escalating the situation. To draw an analogy, the 5 were in a virtual reality with a bunch of cords connecting them to the VR machine. Sol Ji-hoo, Teresa, and Phi Sora were already outside the machine, so unplugging the cords didn't matter to them. But what if the cords had been unplugged while they were still stuck in the virtual world? Just the thought alone made him shiver. Waking his comrades came first. And so, Sol Ji-hoo briefly explained the situation. Things would have been hopeless if he was by himself, but due to Teresa waking up on her own, he became much more confident. At last, the rescue operation commenced with Sol Ji-hoo and Phi Sora in charge of Maria, and Teresa in charge of Hugo. Sol Ji-hoo suggested working together under the protection of the pendant, but Teresa argued that they had to split up to rescue them faster. Thinking that her suggestion was also reasonable, Sol Ji-hoo decided to trust her since she had managed to wake up from her dream by herself. Everyone took different amounts of time to wake up. Perhaps it was due to their different personalities. In Maria's case, for instance, while it wasn't as long as it took him to wake Phi Sora, it still took a long time to wake her up.
Maria had become an absolute wreck in her dream.
To be more precise, she was pitifully begging on the roadside, rejoicing over even a slice of half-eaten bread. It wasn't hard to find her, but the problem was that she had howled the moment she saw him before violently charging at him. "You worthless little shit!
Because of you. Because of you, I." Sol Ji-hoo had to soothe the enraged Maria and convince her that everything was a dream for a very long time before she managed to wake up. On the other hand, when Kazuki, who had been having nightmares about his sister, saw Sol Ji-hoo appear, he immediately realized that he was in a dream and woke up. When Sol Ji-hoo woke up again after rescuing the two of them, he saw Teresa and Hugo lying on both sides of Cho-hong, firmly holding her hands. From the looks of it, Teresa had successfully awakened Hugo and was now trying to rescue Cho-hong together with him. The unexpected turn of events happened when he woke up after rescuing the last member, Marcel Guionia. He had taken a lot of time waking the Archer of Steel up from his dream about his fiancée, but Teresa and Hugo were still asleep. At first glance, the trio's complexions were not good, and all three of them were drenched in sweat. Panicking, Sol Ji-hoo hastily decided to help them, but thankfully, the three woke up before he tried anything. Teresa started to pant heavily immediately after waking up. "Phew! I'm alive. Ehu." Hugo shook his head. Sol Ji-hoo was finally relieved after seeing the bewildered Cho-hong. And with this, the whole expedition team was successfully saved. After the rescue, the expedition team gathered together and sat down far away from the dolmen. It wasn't to exchange opinions, but rather to rest and organize their thoughts. It was only right for them to do so. While only 10 minutes had passed in reality, each of them had experienced at least a few days to a couple of months in their dreams. Furthermore, because the dreams were actually nightmares, they were all unsettled. "Is everyone okay?" Sol Ji-hoo looked at each of the members, who were all sitting with their backs to the stone, and asked. "I'm sorry. I made the wrong decision. I should have done something before we saw the stone. It's not your fault," Kikuzi said in a subdued voice. "Nobody knew what that stone was in the first place. We couldn't have done anything anyway since it instantly exploded with light the moment we saw it. Rather, we should thank you for rescuing us." And he grit his teeth with a lonely expression. It was a really shitty dream. Kei. A strange sound was suddenly heard. It sounded like someone was forcefully holding back their laughter. Sol Ji-hoo and Kazuki stopped talking and turned their eyes to find Hugo trembling with a scrunched-up face. Even Teresa was seen hanging her head with both hands clamped over her mouth and her shoulders visibly shaking. "Ah! Don't allow ha he he he. PFFTT." While Hugo made a strange noise, Cho-hong, who had been blankly sitting there, suddenly had her neck flush red like the color of the setting sun. She fidgeted, not knowing what to do with herself before sneaking a glance at Sol Ji-hoo. Then she stared daggers at Hugo with killing intent. "What are you laughing about? Are you retarded? Phew hey. Hey! That's enough. This fucking bastard doesn't even know other people's feelings. Phew he he he. This little son of a bitch." Cho-hong stood up, huffing. She searched the ground, looking for her thorn of steel before suddenly scrunching her eyebrows. "Huh. Something strange." Hugo snickered. "Look at her changing the subject out of embarrassment." "That's not ITTTT." Cho-hong yelled. "Look at the ground. It's flashing." Kazuki's eyes widened at those words. Kazuki immediately stood up after staring back and forth at the flowing mist in the ground. It's true. It was normal for the light to be dimmer the further they were away. However, the light was extremely clear, and it was blinking on and off, like a light bulb at the end of its lifespan. "Hiek! We have to run."
Maria, who had been suffering from the aftereffects of her nightmare, started to convulse. They had been resting in the forest, completely exhausted, but they all had the same thought.
It was hundreds and thousands of times better to just give up than to have to experience such nightmares again.
It was then.
Wing. All of a sudden, a disturbing noise that sounded like the whirring of a circular saw rang throughout the quiet forest. Checking the last period of activation. Complete. 586 years 274 days 3 hours 26 minutes 47 seconds ago. Steel of evaluation has been successfully activated.
Without waiting for them to respond, a monotonous mechanical voice rang out. Ha! Sol Ji-hoo doubted his ears at the sudden resounding voice.
But regardless of what he thought, the mechanical voice steadily continued. 8 intruders. Correction. 8 humans and 1 soul detected. The evaluation will now commence.
At the same time, a blue light swept through the expedition team like an ocean wave.
Complete. Passing of the trial of nightmares confirmed.
Evaluation changed from rude intruders to unexpected intruders.
Preparing stage 2 alert status. Correction. Soul from the House of Rothschild and promise of temperance confirmed.
Evaluation changed from unexpected intruders to legitimate visitors.
Stage 2 alert status will be cancelled. Additional correction. 2 individuals, who passed the trial on their own, identified.
The qualification of awaited expert is granted on top of legitimate visitors. The mechanical voice dizzily rang in their ears.
Maria stumbled.
What is it saying? I don't know. Visitor? Expert?
Cho-hong also had a dumbfounded face.
However, the quick-witted Sol Ji-hoo immediately grasped the situation. Could it be?
Kazuki opened his mouth.
How this voice deals with people probably depends on the identity of the intruders and how they woke up from the nightmares. Sol Ji-hoo thought the same. You've got to be kidding me. You're saying there is an AI that advanced?
Cho-hong. Kazuki let out a deep sigh.
Don't underestimate Paradise's magic. Several centuries ago, when the Empire enjoyed its golden age and achieved the pinnacle of magic engineering, the quality of life might have been similar to or even beyond that on Earth. But still.
Kazuki turned his gaze away as Cho-hong trailed off mid-sentence. Anyways, the 2 individuals that passed the trials on their own would be.
He glanced at Sol Ji-hoo and Teresa.
But I didn't.
Sol Ji-hoo tilted his head. He was only able to wake up from the nightmare thanks to the pendant. The steel of evaluation or whatever it was called probably passed anyone who didn't receive direct external help as successful.
Master offers legitimate visitors and awaited experts an invitation. If your purpose is only to retrieve the inheritance of the House of Rothschild, please remain standing where you are. If you wish to accept the invitation, please have an awaited expert place a hand on the steel of evaluation. The mechanical voice had unknowingly become extremely polite. Like Kazuki had said, it was likely that its attitude changed according to their qualifications. It doesn't seem like a bad idea.
What will you do? Hearing Kazuki's question, Sol Ji-hoo glanced at Teresa.
Teresa also turned to look at Sol Ji-hoo.
After 1 minute, the invitation will be determined as rejected and the returning of the House of Rothschild's inheritance will commence. 59 seconds, 58 seconds.
There was nothing to think about. Sol Ji-hoo quickly dashed forwards. Towards the steel of evaluation. Ha! Hey! Hey!
Sol Ji-hoo heard Cho-hong calling out, but he didn't stop.
Because he had already checked the color with his 9 eyes. The yellow color had receded from the entire area. And in its place, a golden color was shining.
Not mentioning the golden commandant, he reasoned that the disappearance of the color of the left direction meant that the source of danger was gone along with it.
The steel of evaluation was shining in a blue light like before.
If there was a difference, it would be that instead of exploding with bright flashes, It was now emitting a soft light. Sol Jihu arrived at the stele first, and the rest of the expedition quickly followed.
Maria tripped over a rock as she ran with both hands covering her eyes. 12 seconds, 11 seconds, 10 seconds, 9 seconds.
What an impatient thing. There was no time, even if he wanted to discuss it a bit more.
I'll go. Sol Jihu placed his palm on the stele of evaluation as he spoke.
At that moment,
Wong! A deep sound resounded from the stele of evaluation. His hand felt hot for an instant.
A brilliant light rippled out in a circle around the monument, shaking the entire world.
Ah! Awk!
I told you.
Sol Jihu, you bastard! Thinking that an earthquake was happening, Maria stomped her feet in frustration and cried out.
But excluding Maria, the rest of the expedition team looked around themselves with speechless faces.
The world is. It was dissolving. There was no other way to put it.
Someone exclaimed.
Unbelievable. It was most definitely an unbelievable sight.
Every time the world shook, the leaves would fall off trees and the clouds in the sky would disappear.
It was as if someone splashed an undried painting with water.
The scene in front of the expedition team disappeared like a lie, one element at a time.
And following that, a world that was hiding beneath it began to peek out.
The unveiled scenery was a world that was beautiful enough to make one's jaw drop. The area boasted a spectacular view that made the Harem Palace insignificant in comparison.
Well-maintained roads, bright trees and plants that received plentiful sunshine planted neatly along the sides of the roads, and the petals that drifted in the wind, glittering with light. Soft fragrance entered their nose as they breathed in the air.
A grand golden palace stood in the center of the dazzling garden. In this indescribably marvelous landscape, the palace covered in gold in all its entirety was truly an awe-inspiring spectacle.
Wow! Instead of being just grand, it was almost dreamlike.
Welcome to the main pagoda of ancient sorcery, the Pagoda of Dreams. The dull mechanical voice rang out again.
My master, the dreaming witch, Rissel Lagrazia, is waiting for you. This way, please.
The central road leading to the palace lit up in a soft light as soon as the voice finished.
Sol Jihu stepped forwards as if entranced, and the rest of the expedition team gradually followed after him.
No one ran. Rather, everyone seemed to want to walk a bit slowly. It's really beautiful, almost bewitching, even. Teresa couldn't stop marveling at the sight around her with a dreamy face. Sol Jihu agreed. Walking along the polished, almost mirror-like road and enjoying the feeling of flower petals tickling his face felt blissful.
It felt as if he was receiving the worship of all people.
He felt a strange disappointment when he arrived at the end of the royal road. Then again, he couldn't live here forever.
Wing. Collecting his composure, Sol Jihu intently observed the gates that were automatically opening left and right the moment he arrived.
A short while later, just as Sol Jihu took a step inside after the large gates were completely opened.
I welcome you.
A clear, bright voice, like the sound of a jade marble rolling on a silver plate, entered his ears.
Chapter 218.
The interior of the Golden Palace truly boasted the pinnacle of flamboyance.
Golden symbols were engraved on a lustrous marble background, and even the windowsills had a gold outline.
And with all sorts of decorative items placed everywhere, the palace reminded everyone of France's Palace of Versailles, which was known for its marvelous beauty.
I am very pleased that you think so highly of this poor palace.
A soprano tone voice, like that of a skylark, rang out in everyone's ears, and their eyes naturally headed forward.
A throne made of gold was standing at the end of the vast hallway, which extended like a corridor. And there was a woman slowly standing up from this throne, looking down amiably at the expedition team. The figure looked young and frail, and didn't seem to even reach 150 centimeters. Her blue hair was slicked back and tied into a bun, emphasizing her small, white face even more. Indeed, Rather than a woman, it seemed more proper to call her a young lady. Clack, clack. Sol Ji-hoo snapped out of his daze hearing the clacking of heels.
The young lady was walking down the stairs with modest steps, her hands clasped over her belly button.
As she came closer, her attire became easier to see.
The top of her clothing was a black, Gothic Lolita-style dress, which stuck to her body and outlined her alluring curves, and the bottom was a wide, bell-shaped skirt that reached her ankles.
"Thank you accepting my invitation."
After reaching the bottom of the stairs, she lightly held the hem of her skirt up and bowed politely.
"Welcome to the Pagoda of Dreams, legitimate visitors." She scanned the expedition team briefly. Then, and awaited experts. She smiled at Sol Ji-hoo and Teresa. Her smile was so captivating that she grabbed everyone's attention instantly. However, Sol Ji-hoo didn't let his guard down. The young lady's mouth was curled into a smile, but her clear, ocean-like blue pupils were serene like ice. In the first place, Sol Ji-hoo felt a strong sense of incongruity the moment he entered the place. A single young lady was the only one in such a huge palace? He felt like he was dreaming. "You're right. My reception hasn't been the best, even though such honored guests accepted my invitation. Please forgive this lady's lack of thought with magnanimity." Sol Ji-hoo was taken aback. He hadn't said anything, yet the young lady seemed to have read his thoughts. Her eyes then gently curled into a crescent shape as she raised both her hands. Clap. She clapped. Tutururu tilde. Sol Ji-hoo almost fell backward in shock. It wasn't just him, but everyone in the expedition team. People filled up the palace instantly. They circled around the expedition team, sang, played music, and threw flower petals into the air. "Don't be so surprised." A muffled giggle rang out. "This is the world of my mind." A dreamy voice flowed out rhythmically. "Since this is a dream world, everything I wish for comes true." Russell flicked her hand like the conductor of a symphonic orchestra, and the people disappeared in an instant. The palace regained its serenity. "Did you like my welcoming show?" she asked, her head slightly tilted. Sol Ji-hoo couldn't say anything, setting aside whether he liked it or not. He had experienced all sorts of things thus far, but this was the first time he was experiencing anything similar to what he was experiencing today. Now, Russell clapped again, and the scenery changed. The expedition team was now standing in the middle of a beautiful garden. A white, round table was placed in front of them, with pretty steaming teacups placed on top of it. "Though it's a little late, let me introduce myself." The young lady gently placed her hand over her chest. "My name is Russell LaGrazia." Sol Ji-hoo barely managed to eke out a few words. "The Witch of Dreams. 1. Yes, I was once called by that insignificant name." Russell smiled brightly before sitting down on a chair elegantly. She then opened her palm and pointed at the other chairs. "Please, sit." Sol Ji-hoo hesitated for a moment, but soon steeled his resolve. The Witch of Dreams was treating them properly both as the master of this place and as the one who had invited them. As such, it was only proper that they treat her with the same level of respect as her guests. "Do unto others as they do unto you." "Thank you." Once Sol Ji-hoo sat down, his comrades began to sit one by one. But when everyone sat down, there was one seat left open. "Will the lady inside the pendant not sit?" Russell spoke with a dreamy voice. Opening square bracket exclamation mark question mark closing square bracket. "She knows?" Sol Ji-hoo opened his mouth in a fluster. "Ah. She's not good with strangers. She gets a little shy." The esteemed daughter of the Rothschild house is shy." Russell looked surprised. "I see. I was hoping to talk about all sorts of things with her." Just as she reached out to the table with a slightly disappointed look. "Did Grandpa come here?" Floan hurriedly asked. Russell didn't say anything. She only stared at the pendant with a smile on her face. Ah. Floan must have made a mistake as she stuttered. She continued hesitantly. Excuse me.
I subconsciously blurted out.
Floan spoke with an elegant mannerism, which wasn't like her normal self. No, it's completely fine. Russell spoke without losing her smile. Both you and I are already dead.
There's no reason to upkeep customs from when we were alive.
Opening square bracket ellipsis dot closing square bracket.
Also, I heard that the youngest daughter of the Rothschild house is a pampered tomboy.
Opening square bracket exclamation mark closing square bracket.
Pampered? Tomboy? The pendant shook like a flailing flounder.
Russell stared at it as if it was cute before clearing her throat.
To answer your question, yes, the head of the Rothschild house has indeed visited the Pagoda of Dreams. Realizing the greedy emperor was eyeing him, he requested that I hold onto a portion of the Rothschild's inheritance.
Although this happened hundreds of years ago, I remember it clearly.
Sol Jihu didn't miss Russell's eyebrows turning sharp when she mentioned the emperor. To be honest, I wasn't a huge fan of the Spear of the Empire either. But since I hated the emperor more, I accepted the Rothschild head's request.
Then,
yes, I am still safekeeping the inheritance.
Russell answered as if she knew what Sol Jihu would ask. Then, she paused in the middle of elegantly raising her teacup. An intrigued smile bloomed on her face. Russell opened her mouth. Ah, fuck.
Sol Jihu doubted his ears.
This is getting boring.
Just give us our shit and let us go. Why did this bitch even invite us in the first place?
Russell spoke monotonously. Hiek? Maria screamed.
Sol Jihu exclaimed inwardly.
No way. Maria slammed her head down and pleaded. I'm sorry. Please don't kill me. No. Russell covered her mouth, smiled, then shook her head. I would have picked fault with it if you said it out loud, but you only thought it. It's my fault for reading your mind without permission. It's a bad habit of mine, you see. Maria stealthily raised her head. I can give you the Rothschild house's inheritance whenever. If you'd like, I can give it to you this instant. Russell took a sip of her tea, then carefully put the teacup down. But I would be extremely grateful if you all would listen to why I invited you. Sol Jihu opened his mouth. Of course. By the way. Yes, as I said before, I am someone who died hundreds of years ago. My body most likely turned to ash and scattered away, so not a single piece of it should remain in the world. The person you are talking to now is. Sol Jihu closed his mouth, not being able to finish saying, you said you died in the past. An existence that is a mere remnant thought. For some reason, this woman is full of herself. It's something I heard a lot when I was alive because of my habit of reading other people's thoughts. Please excuse my behavior. Ah. Yes. You don't have to worry about it now. I can hold myself back if it's just for a little bit. Sol Jihu let out a dry cough. When I looked at the historical records, everything regarding the Pagoda of Infection, or rather dreams, was erased. Yes, it was a rather effective measure. Russell replied firmly. I dearly wished that the dream infection would reach the emperor, but I never imagined he would respond so strongly as soon as it began to spread. Russell then added, he had many enemies, so he was always in a hurry to protect himself. There wasn't much I could do back then. I formed a powerful curse around the pagoda so no one could approach it, but I also couldn't step a foot outside of it. Sol Jihu examined Russell closely. This witch had once planned to overthrow the empire. But setting aside how incredible she was, he questioned her methods. Strictly speaking, the Pagoda of Dreams infection would have negatively affected the empire's innocent civilians. You're right. Because of my pagoda, countless good, law-abiding citizens died. Russell admitted without reserve. But I don't regret it. Because many followers of the emperor also died. And those people all deserved death. Sol Jihu became a bit afraid.
hearing how she made it seem like it wasn't a big deal.
He interlocked his fingers and asked, "I'd like to know why you went so far. Isn't that obvious?"
Russell spoke in a singing tone. To eliminate the war-crazed emperor. Her tiny shoulders trembled faintly as she clutched her hands.
And the tyrannous followers, who support him in his madness.
Sol Jihu instinctively shrunk back as chills suddenly ran down his spine and goosebumps spread around his entire body. A bitter coldness shot out of Russell's body like thorns.
It was so cold that Sol Jihu imagined himself being in a large -40 freezer. That was how enraged Russell was. What power! The energy she was giving off far surpassed that of Floan. Sol Jihu finally caught a glimpse of how powerful this witch was. She might be evenly matched even against a parasite army commander. Russell took a deep breath, then soothed her energy. "Excuse me." Gasps flowed out from all directions. "Anyway, after this decision by the Emperor, I made every effort to strengthen the curse. But there was an undeniable limit with a mortal body. Even after painstaking effort, all I obtained was the qualification to pursue the origin." Russell blurred the end of her speech, trailing into a hard-to-understand concept.
"There is one reason why I invited you all." After a brief moment of silence, Russell took a sip of tea and spoke again.
"Although the curse's power has weakened immensely due to the passage of time, I spent my lifetime creating it. Since two of you were able to escape this curse through your own power, you must have strong willpower."
"That's not really it." Sol Jihu scratched his head.
"I will be open and honest. I am looking for someone who can fulfill the wish I failed to achieve in my lifetime."
Sol Jihu furrowed his brows. Russell's wish had to be the collapse of the empire.
"I know.
The tyrannous emperor and his followers must have all died, and many things must have changed from the passage of time.
Still, my desire to get revenge has not changed nor has it diminished.
Going back to its founding, the empire took root on a rotten ground, so it ought to be overthrown.
Even if hundreds of years have passed since then." She must have misunderstood Sol Jihu's expression.
"Of course, I don't plan to force this task onto you."
And she really must have stopped reading others' minds. "And I am not requesting that you do something about it either." Or perhaps she didn't know anything about the outside situation due to being stuck in this place.
"But if you do accept my request, I will also help you to the best of my abilities."
No matter the case, she definitely had a huge misunderstanding.
"This pagoda of dreams also has my inheritance.
Its scale and importance are incomparable to that of the Rothschild house."
Russell spoke proudly as she strutted out her small chest. Sol Jihu blinked. "This person isn't normal either, huh?"
Resentment that remains even after hundreds of years. It was hard to understand where her thirst for revenge was coming from.
Although it was only a guess, it didn't seem like Russell wanted to topple the empire purely because of a war. There's another reason. There had to be a more certain reason that she hated the empire's origin so much.
In any case, Sol Jihu decided that it wasn't something the expedition team should be involved in.
No, even if he wanted to help her out, her wish was no longer fulfillable.
If there was one thing he could tell her, though,
that was to tell an important truth to the young lady, who had been living in a dream for hundreds of years.
Russell asked, her pupils sparkling. "So?
What do you think?"
You can take your time before answering." Next, she raised her 1/3 full teacup. In a way, what Sol Jihu was about to tell her was cruel.
"So?" He hesitated a little bit before speaking. "It may be presumptuous of me, but there is something I would like to tell you before saying yes or no."
Russell nodded her head, gesturing at him to go on.
"The empire."
With a short breath,
Sol Jihu spoke firmly. "Has already fallen."
Peeved. Tea gushed out of her small, cherry-like lips, splattering everywhere.
Russell went stiff and stood in place holding the teacup as if time had frozen for her. The only thing that showed she was still conscious was her busily blinking eyes. Sol Ji-hoo opened his mouth and put the nail in the coffin. It collapsed more than 10 years ago. Its people were killed regardless of their social status, and not a single tuft of grass remains on the empire's territory.
Slowly, very slowly, Russell raised her head. Silence descended once again.
The fall of the empire, which stood strong at the peak of paradise for a long time, must have come as a huge shock because she only stared blankly without even thinking to put down her teacup.
Ah! Russell's tightly shut mouth opened slightly. No. And Sol Ji-hoo was able to witness.
Excuse me? Her ever-smiling face crumbled down in an instant. 1. This title is slightly different from what the mechanical voice said in the last chapter.
Last one specifically said, the dreaming witch, while this one says, the witch of dreams. Chapter 219.
How should I explain this situation?
Sol Ji-hoo fell into deep thought. Russell was still frozen with shock plastered all over her face. Princess, there's something I want to ask you. Sol Ji-hoo leaned toward Teresa, who was sitting right by him, and whispered a question. Is the empire collapsing that shocking? Yes. Teresa answered without a shred of hesitation. It's not just humanity.
Their magic engineering far surpassed every other race in paradise, so much so that they weren't even mildly comparable. Including the native races that are part of the Federation, the empire reigned over all of paradise for well over 1,000 years.
Teresa spoke with strength.
A country where the sun never sets.
That was the empire as a nation. Sol Ji-hoo smacked his lips. But, the invading force is a god.
It wasn't as if the empire didn't have gods on their side.
Teresa shook her head. Even if the parasite queen was stronger than the empire's gods, the empire still fell too quickly. I had a similar reaction when I first heard that the empire fell. I thought some fool was cracking a joke. It was that absurd. Sol Ji-hoo turned to Russell once again. Clang!
Ah! The teacup fell and broke. Just as Sol Ji-hoo was about to rekindle the conversation.
Wait! Russell quickly pushed her open palm out. She looked extremely anxious. Please give me a more detailed explanation.
Perhaps because she had read everyone's minds, she seemed to be certain that the fall of the empire wasn't a lie.
Sol Ji-hoo looked back at Teresa. When it came to history, it was much better to have someone who had experienced it firsthand to give the explanation.
You don't have to say anything.
Just recall what happened slowly and in order. Teresa calmly closed her eyes. Sol Ji-hoo observed Russell's face during this time, which was rather interesting. Shock, doubt, disbelief. By the end of the imagery, her eyes rolled back to her head. Now unmasked, Russell displayed emotions with rich expressions. The only downside was that most of the emotions she showed were negative. Soon. How foolish. As Teresa opened her eyes, Russell shot up from her seat. The slender white face reddened like a ripe apple. Then, she turned around before wandering back and forth in the garden. Wait! That action! It happened when someone really didn't like something. For example, Sol Ji-hoo had done the same thing when Gyula gave him his old class name. Her eyes narrowed. Russell wet her lips with her saliva. What? Another universe? But still. Ha! And she muttered while fiddling with her fingers. She even picked up her tray forcefully and slammed it down. Why is she angry? Sol Ji-hoo tilted his head. He could understand her being taken aback, but Russell was someone who hated the empire. He felt like she should be clapping her hands in joy knowing that it had fallen. Damn it! For what reason did I? But when he saw her tilting her head back and shaking her tightly clenched fists, he finally understood. Russell must have waited for hundreds of years for a chance to exact her vengeance. But the target of her vengeance had crumbled like a sandcastle and vanished.
The difference between personally exacting vengeance on her sworn enemy and having it done coincidentally must be like the difference between heaven and earth.
Sol Ji-hoo couldn't fathom the sense of loss Russell must be feeling. It wasn't until 40 minutes later that Russell stopped fidgeting and showed signs of calming down.
During this time, the expedition team shut their mouths and maintained their silence.
Russell was seething so much that they feared she would break something if provoked. Who?
After an earth-shattering sigh, Russell swept her forehead up in frustration before pausing.
Looking at the expedition team sitting awkwardly around the table, she lowered her head in embarrassment. I apologize for my unsightly display.
No, it's totally fine. Rather than unsightly, her actions were rather funny. Sol Ji-hoo and the rest of the expedition team knew they shouldn't laugh, but they couldn't help but find this situation funny.
We should be apologizing for saying something unnecessary. Russell shook her head. No, not at all. I'm glad I found out. Yes, I'm glad, but… Russell covered her face with her hands, unable to finish her sentence. Empire, you son of a gun. She muttered to herself, but everyone clearly heard what she said. Ah!
After a moment, Russell slowly took her hands off and spoke powerlessly. You said you were here to take the Rothschild house's inheritance, yes?
Yes.
Sol Ji-hoo replied immediately.
Promise of temperance and a blood-related soul of the Rothschild house.
There's no room for doubts. Ha! This was already the second time she was sighing. After hesitating for some time, Russell nodded her head and spoke. By the name of Russell LaGrazia. No, I'll skip the formalities since I'm fuming.
For now, let's go ahead with returning the inheritance.
For now?
Just as Sol Ji-hoo was about to raise a question. Chalk!
A clap rang out. At the same time, the scenery changed once again. This time, no one was surprised. Everyone fell on their butts because they were transported while they were seated, but no one let out even a tiny groan. They seemed to be in the basement of the palace. Although the place was generally dark, there were several stones on the ceiling illuminating the ground, so it wasn't difficult to see. The only problem was that there were countless rooms around them, so much that they couldn't begin to count. It felt like they were standing in the middle of a maze of doors. Let's see, the Rothschild house's inheritance. Russell looked around the doors, then snapped her fingers. Then, something surprising happened. The tens of thousands of doors began to rotate in a clockwise direction before abruptly coming to a stop. Looking at a white door at the front, Russell nodded her head. Here it is. I remember expanding the storage room quite a bit because of the volume of the items. Sol Ji-hoo's expectations went up, hearing that there was a large volume of the items. When Russell walked up and caressed the door opened on its own. Sol Ji-hoo looked on with a beating heart as his eyes tensed up. As soon as the door opened, a murky fog flowed out before a multicolored light shot out. No one had entered the room and its inside was still invisible, yet a brilliant light illuminated the entire space. Just how much is in there? The inheritance buried here was the Spear of the Empire, and the Rothschild's secret techniques. There shouldn't be much gold, yet it was shining so brightly? Sol Ji-hoo doubled his efforts in calming his beating heart and stared at Russell. Russell quietly backed off before gesturing at the room. This inheritance is yours. You do not need my permission to take it. Several gazes fell on his back. Everyone was clearly eager to go in. This particularly stinging gaze must be Miss Maria's. All right. Sol Ji-hoo wanted to run inside, but he kept himself in check and walked slowly on purpose. Maria's aroused panting was getting on his nerves, but he forgot about her the moment he entered the room. He almost couldn't breathe. A mountain of treasures. He couldn't describe the scene in any other way. Gold, silver, and all sorts of jewels were stacked on top of each other, forming a hill. Sol Ji-hoo walked in as though he was entranced and reached out. When he grabbed a handful of riches and then loosened his hand, a colorful waterfall trickled down.
Talk, talk, talk. Drrrrrr.
The sound of riches striking the ground enhanced the emotions he was feeling.
What shocked him even more was that these weren't gold coins, but gold eggs. They weren't the egg-shaped gold nuggets he found at the emperor's villa, but prettier spherical eggs. My God!
This was meant to only be a fraction of the Rothschilds' wealth.
Sol Ji-hoo finally understood why the emperor got so greedy.
A rectangular glass casket was placed in the middle of the room, and lying inside it was something that was wrapped in a blue cloth. Next to it, Sol Ji-hoo could also see a fairly big, faded treasure chest. The symbol engraved onto the side of the chest caught Sol Ji-hoo's eyes.
The Rothschilds insignia. He recognized it instantly as he had seen it before in historical records.
That wasn't all.
On one side of the room were 10 rectangular wooden chests neatly organized like parcels. What a mess! It's because I never tended to them after I received them. Following Russell's voice, the mountain wiggled. Clang, clang. Along with the pleasant clattering of riches, gold bars and gold eggs separated themselves from the mountain and moved to the left. Swish!
Next, the various jewels all shot up and moved to the right.
A mountain of gold, a mountain of silver, and a mountain of jewels.
Sol Ji-hoo trembled. This young lady will step aside for a moment.
Russell's voice rang out.
Judging by her cold voice, she still seemed to be in shock. By the time Sol Ji-hoo turned around, Russell was nowhere to be found.
Only then did a loud cheer burst out. Pyaik! Maria howled and charged into the gold mountain at a frightening speed.
Ha! Ha! It's real.
Dream. This must be a dream.
Cho-hong speechlessly stared at the mountains with her jaw dropped, and Marcel Guionia rubbed his eyes in doubt.
You wah! Hugo roared. Moom! And Teresa searched for her mother before running into Sol Ji-hoo's embrace. I've never seen anything like it.
Kazuki muttered in a daze before glancing sideways and asking, "Did you know about the inheritance?"
Sol Ji-hoo pushed the clinging Teresa away and narrowly smiled.
The expedition team's minds were all over the place. The three mountains were quite a bit smaller thanks to Russell cleanly separating the huge mountain, but the expedition team's shock had not diminished in the slightest. Maria, who was lying in the mountain of gold eggs and jamming her mouth with them, rubbed her puffed-up cheeks with sparkling eyes.
It was my dream to try this.
She then got in a diving pose, catapulted herself into the mountain, then started swimming.
Arg, fine. Cho-hong threw herself at the mountain of jewels.
Meanwhile, Hugo was grabbing handfuls of silver and throwing them into the air.
You-hee-hee-hee-hee. Ki-hee-hee-hee-hee. Elated didn't begin to describe them. Ha-ha, ho-ho. Sol Ji-hoo smiled, seeing his overjoyed comrades, and then clapped his hands. Hearing this, everyone flinched and looked back.
Because of Russell, they seemed to be conditioned to respond to claps.
Ah, geez Tilda. You surprised me Tilda.
Normally, they would have thrown a fit at his prank, but the bountiful rewards must have broadened their hearts, as Cho-hong and Maria both smiled adorably. Sol Ji-hoo spoke while laughing. As you all know, Lady Russell didn't seem to be in a good mood.
Maria, who was gracefully doing backstrokes in the ocean of gold, abruptly stopped.
Since she is exercising courtesy as the master of this palace, we need to do the same as her guests. Don't be too loud.
Let's get what we came for and hurry back.
Sol Ji-hoo could tell at a glance that everyone fully agreed. They had experienced firsthand how absurdly powerful Russell was.
Leaving this place as soon as possible was clearly 1,000 times better than staying unnecessarily and potentially offending her.
Now that they had obtained such unprecedented wealth, they would be too bitter to ascend if they died without spending any of it.
At last, the expedition team began to bag the riches by category.
As Seol Ji-hoo had prepared several large, weight-reducing backpacks, there was no need to worry about not being able to bring them all back. Just as everyone was busy stuffing the bags, the ceiling began to tremble faintly.
Rumble. Thud. Listening carefully, it sounded like things were breaking and crumbling down. A few members looked up at the ceiling in a daze. Kayak! Kayak! Fuck! Fuick! Screams and heavy curses were fired out loud. Seol Ji-hoo, who was in the middle of bagging gold bars and eggs, furrowed his brows and warned solemnly. Maria, didn't I tell you to quiet down? I understand how happy you are, but you don't have to curse like it's your last. Huh? I didn't do anything. Maria rebutted resentfully as if to ask why he was accusing an innocent person. It wasn't Miss Maria? Seol Ji-hoo tilted his head. In any case, the sound subsided, and everyone went back to work. Because of the sheer amount of riches, packing them all up was taking a long time. However, no one uttered a single complaint. In fact, they worked hard not to leave out a single thing. Don't just stuff them in like they're rocks on the side of the road. If anyone gets even a single scratch of any of them, expect to get smashed by my mace. Cho Hong even gave an intimidating warning while laughing. I'm looking. I know I'm not the one to speak, but let's not fill up the wrong pocket today. Hugo also growled with his eyes lit up. Seol Ji-hoo was astonished inwardly. This was the first time he saw the duo so focused and passionate. Master Jang would be overjoyed if they acted the same while training. After the team bagged more than half of the riches, Seol Ji-hoo suddenly felt something poking his side. Teresa was pointing at the door. Seol Ji-hoo saw Russell standing outside the door, watching them quietly. From the way she was staring at him fixedly, Seol Ji-hoo figured she had something to ask. Seol Ji-hoo gave the bag in his hand to Teresa, then walked to the door. You seem to be having fun. Ah. Ha ha. Seol Ji-hoo laughed awkwardly and studied Russell's face. Her eyes were faintly curled up to a smile. She seemed to have calmed down a bit. I apologize for leaving so suddenly. What I heard was just too shocking. No, it's totally fine. I fully understand. I thank you for your generosity. Russell sighed. Then, she looked up with pitiful eyes, like a tragic heroine of a story. I thought about it while watching the serene lake at the silent flower garden. Seol Ji-hoo glanced at Russell. For some reason, rock crumbs were littering her tiny shoulders. Russell dusted her shoulders off in a startle. Ah, please ignore these. I fell down while staggering. Oh, my. Anyway. Russell changed the topic immediately. I'm sorry to bother you while you are busy, but can you give me some time? It won't take long. Russell's expression lacked the composure it once had and was very serious. Seol Ji-hoo's intuition told him that Russell would make another request. Chapter 220. Her request couldn't possibly be more absurd than overthrowing the empire. Thinking that it wouldn't hurt to hear her out, Seol Ji-hoo accepted. Of course, any time. Thank you. Then. Russell expressed her gratitude, then slowly raised her hands. Seol Ji-hoo opened his eyes and let out a small gasp. The palace's beautiful interior was nowhere to be seen, and he could only see a destroyed ruin. White steam was rising from the debris, and it was obvious who the perpetrator was. After all, only Russell and the expedition team were in this place. Ah, I'm in the middle of remodeling the place. Russell quickly spoke up, noticing the flustered look on Seol Ji-hoo's face. The shocking news made me want to change in my surroundings. Covering her mouth and chortling, Russell waved her hand and restored the broken golden palace. This way, please. Seol Ji-hoo somehow came to tour the palace, staying tensed the whole time. He stared fixedly at Russell, who was walking ahead. After about 5 minutes, she sparked the conversation. Pitiful, aren't I? I ended up like this after talking so high and mighty.
Well, it was funny at first, but Sol Ji-hoo didn't mean to ridicule Russell in any way.
Not at all.
After all, she had endlessly put in the effort to accomplish her goal. While dreaming for several hundred years, to boot. How clear must her sense of purpose have been to not be shaken for so long?
If anything, her unwavering mental fortitude was something to respect and emulate. At that moment, Russell opened her mouth.
Do you know what sorcery is? It was a sudden, seemingly random question. But realizing that it had something to do with whatever she would bring up next, Sol Ji-hoo listened carefully.
Russell must not have been expecting an answer as she continued calmly.
Magic refers to the act of using mana, a power unique to humans, to carry out incomprehensible feats.
Witchcraft is the technique of manifesting all kinds of phenomena by borrowing the power of supernatural existences or other mystical powers.
She continued explaining clearly and concisely.
What I call sorcery is a new discipline that combines these two together. She then turned her head and smiled at Sol Ji-hoo. It is also the reason I came to be called a witch. Sol Ji-hoo reflected on what she said before asking. You mean?
You, Lady Russell, founded the discipline of sorcery?
Yes.
When I was alive, the Empire treated me as a heretic and a thorn on the side because of it.
Russell spoke as if it wasn't a big deal,
and Sol Ji-hoo had a puzzled expression. Why? Isn't witchcraft a discipline too? The Empire as a nation was built with magic as its foundation. Russell replied with an unprecedented stiffness.
A nation of magic, by magic, and for magic. They only allowed their people to walk the path of a mage. All other disciplines were targets to be eliminated. Russell furtively bit her lip.
Witchcraft was especially persecuted. Not only did its practitioners not worship the Empire's gods, but individual worship of idols was also regarded as sacrilege during that period.
Sol Ji-hoo finally caught a glimpse of why Russell resented the Empire so much. While he couldn't be certain, it seemed Russell suffered something similar to a witch hunt when she was alive. Wasn't that why she wanted to uproot the Empire, whose foundations were based on magic?
Let me say this in case you are misunderstanding me. I do not hate magic.
Whether it be magic or witchcraft,
I believe that they are both fascinating disciplines.
I simply hated the Empire's sole emphasis on magic. Then couldn't you have just left the Empire and take asylum elsewhere?
Where? The Empire's influence was spread throughout the entire continent.
What nation would have accepted me? My only choice would have been to live in exile in a hideout where no one could find me.
Russell heaved out a small sigh. As long as you are born a citizen of the Empire, you must follow its laws. Well, I don't think that's wrong. But, I absolutely could not abandon witchcraft.
For one reason.
Russell hesitated for a long time, then seemingly made up her mind and spoke.
You see, I am not a native inhabitant of this world.
Excuse me? Sol Ji-hoo was taken aback by her shocking confession.
Let me rephrase myself. I was certainly born and raised in paradise, but the Grazia House's ancestor is not from this world. She was an inhabitant of another world but was banished to paradise after getting wrapped up in an incident.
Russell shrugged. Though it may be hard to believe, it is true.
The records left behind by our ancestor clearly said so. Sol Ji-hoo realized that this wasn't anything to be surprised about. Thinking about it now, he was in the same position. Still, another world.
Suddenly intrigued, Sol Ji-hoo asked.
What is that world called? The records say it is called Hall Plane, 1.
Hall Plane. Then how did your ancestor end up getting banished to paradise? My ancestor seemed to have been both the hero and saintess of that world. Joining hands with 3 comrades, she overcame all sorts of obstacles and hardships to save humanity.
It is truly a fairy tale-like story. Russell explained slowly as if she was telling a folk tale to a child.
But the after story of the fairy tale was awfully cruel. Once everything ended, the magician of the party revealed his lascivious desire for the fairy queen. Not only did he kidnap the fairy queen, but he also kidnapped the hero, whom she was engaged to, and held them captive in his base. Seol Ji-hoo was taken aback. The story that was full of hopes and dreams suddenly turned into a tragedy. Saintess Grazia, who later found out what happened, led her troops to the traitor's base to rescue her two comrades.
Unfortunately, the rescue ended in failure.
Not only were her troops defeated in an overwhelming fashion, but dimensional travel was forcefully cast on the Saintess.
In essence, she was banished from her world. Ah! I'm sorry. Seol Ji-hoo belatedly realized his mistake. He had ended up asking more than what was necessary because he was intrigued. Smiling bashfully, he spoke. I'm sorry.
No, this is one of the reasons I revolted against the Empire.
One of the reasons for revolting.
As soon as Seol Ji-hoo heard these words, he came up with a conjecture.
Lady Russell, did you want to return to Hall Plain?
You're very perceptive.
Russell smiled gently. Yes, I did. But rather than yearning to go, I probably wanted to escape reality.
I was also curious and didn't really like this world. But dimensional travel isn't easy, you know?
Rather, it's something that mere mortals wouldn't dare to dream about.
She was right.
Earthlings were able to enter paradise through the power of paradise's gods.
In other words, one would have to have power on par with gods to be able to accomplish something similar.
I came to a conclusion after long deliberation.
That if I couldn't leave this unfair world, I would change it myself.
For the sake of future generations, I would provide a climate where anyone can share their knowledge and understanding of any discipline.
And to do that, the empire, which built itself atop the path of magic, had to be destroyed.
Seol Ji-hoo's brows perked up. Changing the world. Those words continuously echoed in his ears.
That's why I attempted to combine magic and witchcraft. Because at that moment, I wished for a new, formidable power that no one else had.
Of course, other people told me I was crazy and did their best to stop me, but that's incredible. Seol Ji-hoo couldn't hide his admiration. Russell blinked blankly, pausing mid-sentence.
Excuse me? So you tried something no one else has ever done and succeeded in pioneering an independent field.
What Russell said truly held great significance to Seol Ji-hoo. He was struggling to become a true high ranker, and he felt like he finally found a lead.
That wasn't all.
The two of them were surprisingly similar in more ways than one.
Seol Ji-hoo also wanted to change paradise, expelling the parasites and a portion of humanity in the process. But seeing how flustered Russell was, Seol Ji-hoo scratched his head.
Did I say something rude?
And no.
I just didn't expect you to really think that. I've never seen such a reaction. Russell stuttered greatly.
My apologies.
In the past, everyone had the same reaction when I said this.
What did they say?
That I was full of myself. I've also heard, crazy bitch, insane, screw off, and, agu girl, you're driving me crazy.
Seol Ji-hoo wasn't sure about the others, but he felt like he knew who said the last line.
This is the first time I've been praised.
What I'm saying is that it was pretty nice.
Russell stole glances at Seol Ji-hoo, then cleared her throat and put on airs. Yes. It is indeed incredible. Miracle bestows the bridge known as chance to those who strive. With heaven's providence, I was able to open up a new realm. You don't understand how deeply moved I was when I first chanced upon the origin.
Origin?
The origin is… Russell quickly shut her mouth in the middle of her speech. The origin is… She hesitated.
It didn't look like she was hesitant to tell him. Rather, the concept seemed too difficult and boundless for her to explain with simple words.
After a long time. The rising of the sun and the setting of the moon. Roussel quietly opened her mouth. When the moon rises, the sun sets. Water flows down from top to bottom.
The fundamental principles and the causes of the natural phenomena of the world are known as the origin. She seemed more serious and careful than ever before.
In truth, even I don't know much about the origin.
Of course, I am proud of my achievement in making contact with it as a mere mortal, but from the perspective of the entire universe, I had already set one foot in the door.
Sol Jihu was suddenly relieved to not have chosen the path of a magician. It was because he didn't understand a thing Roussel just said. I only gained the most basic qualification to explore it. Roussel suddenly stopped pacing around. Sol Jihu noticed that his surroundings had gotten dark.
They must have arrived at a specific destination while absorbed in their conversation. The place seemed to be a royal chamber of sorts, and Roussel was walking up a staircase leading to an altar.
The spring of bottomless wisdom and the proof that I touched the edge of the origin.
A fist-sized orb was floating by itself on the square altar, radiating a delicate glow of a firefly.
Roussel stood in front of the altar and caressed the glowing orb preciously.
Next, she turned back to Sol Jihu and revealed the identity of the light with a flushed voice.
I call this the eternal light of wisdom. She then continued. I've thought a lot about it, really. I had only 2 wishes in my life: dimensional travel and the fall of the empire. But I failed to achieve them both.
One was a wish that she could not fulfill, and the other was a wish that could not be fulfilled.
Roussel tilted her head up and stared at the ceiling.
How should I say this?
I haven't felt such a sense of loss for a long time. I went so far as to employ an expedient to become an immortal existence, all to wait and wait again. Roussel's deeply rooted hatred had served as a driving force that allowed her to persevere.
But with Sol Jihu telling her the truth, her hatred now had nowhere to go. If she had a living body, the shock would have relegated her to the bed, sick.
The fall of the empire is an undeniable truth. There is no longer a reason for me to exist. But Roussel stared blankly before opening her mouth. I also hated the idea of simply disappearing in vain.
With a bitter expression, she stroked the eternal light of wisdom.
I mean, wouldn't you feel the same way? The Grazia bloodline ended in my generation.
The name disappearing in both Paradise and Hall Plain without leaving behind a trace. That's too sad and frustrating. I devoted my life, sacrificing my mind and body to achieve what I did.
Afraid of losing the fruit of years of labor and effort. With that, Roussel closed her mouth.
Sol Jihu maintained his silence as well. Not wanting to disappear into the mists of history. Sol Jihu could empathize with this.
So I decided. Now that things have come to this, I will at least leave behind proof that I, Roussel La Grazia, existed in this world. I will leave behind a trace of the House of Grazia.
After a long silence, Roussel stared at Sol Jihu.
So, I have just one request for you. She finally got to the point. Can you bring me someone with talent in this discipline? Sol Jihu's eyes widened at her unexpected request.
Discipline?
Yes, someone who can accept the eternal light of wisdom. Simply put, someone to become my successor. Sol Jihu subconsciously stared at the orb of light.
A powerful attraction seemed to suck him in, so he quickly averted his gaze. I don't know. Her request this time was 1,000 times easier than something as absurd as asking to destroy the empire. But just how many people would understand the value of this orb of light? After all, even he wasn't so sure. If someone accepts that light, how should I say this? Will that person become different from an ordinary magician?
Different? Roussel's voice went up at once. The way her cheeks turned red, it almost seemed like Sol Jihu just insulted her.
But knowing that Sol Jihu didn't mean any harm, she stopped at a simple snort.
It will be more correct to say they're distinct. She spoke firmly as if it wasn't worth mentioning a second time. Of course, I can't say the realm I achieved is the best.
But the eye of heaven, which can catch a glimpse of the origin, is an innate power that only a few chosen are born with, and the third eye, which can even see through this heaven, is a heaven beyond heaven power.
There is no need to even mention it. At least, when we're talking about human capabilities. It was yet another thing that didn't make any sense. Sol Jihu blamed himself for asking something he shouldn't have.
Since the eternal light of wisdom is largely affected by one's bloodline, their innate qualities greatly affect their affinity to it. But that doesn't mean a random person can acquire this ability through effort.
Even the few who have talent must endeavor for a lifetime just to have a chance of grasping it. She babbled on, then glanced sideways. When Sol Jihu sang about how great she was, putting her on a pedestal, she hunched her shoulders and shook her head. Then, she strutted her chest out. Going back to the main point, my successor would be in a different position. He or she would only need to take my mastery in sorcery in full. With my help, it shouldn't be too difficult. Just as Sol Jihu was about to ask, what about me? Of course, I would be elated if he or she had a natural talent, but I would really love for this person to be hardworking and constantly striving to study this discipline. But after hearing what she said next, he swallowed his words. There was a saying that having too much was as bad as having too little. He was struggling to reach the realm Zhang Maldong told him about, so he had no confidence in being able to digest the eternal light of wisdom. Most importantly, he wanted to pioneer a new realm, rather than following in the tracks of a realm that someone else created. Wait. At that moment, Sol Jihu suddenly thought of something and flinched. Isn't that coming up? Soon, the March neutral zone, which currently held unprecedented attention of Paradise, would open. If Sol Jihu could recruit a talented Earthling, he would be able to have Paradise's sole sorcerer as his comrade. It was only then that Sol Jihu realized how great a fortune he had chanced upon. It looks like our interests coincide. Russell smiled, having read Sol Jihu's thoughts. You'll accept this young lady's request, yes? Yes. But it may take a while. You can take your time. Russell replied with a bitter smile. I have waited for hundreds of years already. Waiting a few dozen more won't be a problem. No, you don't have to wait that long. A few months at the earliest and a few years at the latest. It will be better for me the quicker you are. Anyway, I'm glad. Russell looked relieved. So once I find the successor, I just have to bring them here? Yes, but… Russell stared at the pendant hanging on Sol Jihu's neck. Wouldn't it be better for us to keep in touch? Is there a way we can do that? Of course. Russell shouted with a bright, cheerful expression. Sorcery has the power of creation as its foundation. It can achieve all sorts of wondrous things. Skipping toward Sol Jihu, she placed her hand on his pendant before taking it off. Once a faint trace of light momentarily fogged up the jewel, she smiled furtively. What did she do? Don't worry. I'm not so shameless as to force myself in when there's already a lady of the house. Excuse me? Sol Jihu asked back as always. Russell chuckled, then looked down. It looks like your comrades have finished packing up the inheritance. Already? Yes, they are grumbling about you not coming back. Some are also worried. Right. Since they got everything there was to get, it made sense that they would want to leave this place as soon as possible. Will you go back now? Yes, please. He got what he came here for, so Sol Jihu nodded his head. Russell bowed politely. Thank you for listening to my unreasonable request. She then continued with smiling eyes. Thanks to you, I spent a refreshing, cheerful time for the first time in a while. Not at all. No, really. I am not trying to flatter you. The taste of a heartfelt praise is really… She trailed off, then asked with a beaming smile. Ah, right. I gave up on the pendant, so please, do forgive me if I show up in your dreams every once in a while. Now what did this mean? Sol Ji-hoo raised a question, but Russell didn't answer. She simply put on a strange expression. Fufu, your comrades are getting anxious. Russell slowly raised her arms.
Then, until the next time we meet, I pray for your well-being.
Her dreamy voice flowed out like music. And before Sol Ji-hoo could say a thing, I hope you had a great dream. Russell's hands quickly came together. Chalk. Asterisk. Sol Ji-hoo's eyes flickered open. Huh. Things felt different than when he woke up from the nightmare. He felt refreshed, like he just got a good night's sleep. When his blurry vision came into focus, Sol Ji-hoo gulped hard.
The same sounds of surprise rang out around him. The expedition team was lying in the middle of the forest again. Seeing that the steel of evaluation had flickered off, he realized what must have happened. The expedition team had unknowingly fallen asleep and dreamed.
Even flown. He couldn't tell whether what he saw was a dream or a reality. Ah. Shit. Cho-hong, who was rubbing her forehead drowsily, hurriedly shot up. Seeing the bags sprawled around them, she glanced at them half in doubt. Please, please. Pleading earnestly, she untied the knot on a bag. A big grin immediately spread across her face. She grabbed a handful of gold and burst into laughter. Look! It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a dream. You ha 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 ha. Fuck. I thought I had another nightmare. Maria breathed a huge sigh of relief and began to check the bags one by one.
Just where have you been? Hugo nudged Sol Ji-hoo, who was sitting in a daze, and asked. Oh, it's nothing.
I just had a talk with her.
Sol Ji-hoo finally got up and looked at Cho-hong and Maria, who were staring into the bags. Everything good?
Yeah.
We made sure not a tiny speck of gold was left behind.
Hugo smacked his chest and answered. Sol Ji-hoo had a feeling he could trust these words 100%. Hugo guffawed while massaging Sol Ji-hoo's shoulders.
Sol, I've never seen a fortune like this in my entire life.
Telling you to join Carpe Diem back then was the best decision I ever made. Look at all this money.
Hugo's excitement hadn't subsided a bit.
Money?
Sol Ji-hoo grinned.
Right, money wasn't bad. But the real jackpot was elsewhere. Sol Ji-hoo clutched the pendant tightly and looked around the forest.
He might be mistaken, but the forest seemed to have gotten brighter.
No, he was certain it did. The fog was gone, and so was the ghastly blue light.
The area was no longer dark and damp, but cool and refreshing. Sol Ji-hoo turned around.
Facing the cool breeze that blew against his face, a cheerful smile spread across his face. Let's get out of this forest now. The expedition team responded louder than ever before.